How do you talk about The Simpsons? How do you talk about a show that has stood like a monolith over the entire genre of animation, if not the shared culture of the entire world? A show whose titular family is more recognizable than many world leaders. A show whose influence on television is so thorough that multiple common narrative devices now derive their names from its characters. A show that has contributed multiple words to the English language, embiggening the dictionary as much as other legends like William Shakespeare or Dr. Seuss. Or maybe that's not the correct question to ask. Rather than asking how to talk about The Simpsons, it might be better to ask how it's possible not to talk about The Simpsons. It's permeated culture so thoroughly that terms derived from its characters and events have become the standard by which we gauge other works. The steady simplification of a character in a long-running show, call it Flanderization, or an episodic gag designed to keep viewers engaged during a show's theme song, call that a couch gag. Does your show take place in an unnamed town meant to serve as a stand-in for anywhere? You're pulling a Springfield. The Are We There Yet bit, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, a wizard did it, stupid, sexy, Flanders. The Simpsons isn't just a major part of culture, but it's a major part of the meta around that culture. The TV tropes page that lists tropes named after The Simpsons is longer than the page describing many individual works. So to better understand something as well received and beloved as The Simpsons is also to better understand culture and the people surrounding it. It's practically a lesson in current events and history to see how a show like this approaches a topic and then satirizes it. Because to so easily capture the hearts and attention of so many Western viewers, the show has to have something universal to it. Something that causes all of us to see ourselves in the characters and events and setting without being so generic as to come across as bland and uninteresting. Just the opposite, in fact. Because reviewing all 33 seasons in a single video would likely take me so long that a 34th would be out by the time I finish, I'm going to be splitting this video up into multiple parts, which themselves will come out non-consecutively so I don't burn out on the concept. This video will be split into individual episode retrospectives, which themselves are split into 3 sections: recap, review, and wrap-up. Recap is a short retelling of the events of the episode. Review is a general detailing of my opinions on the episode, as well as some context for those opinions. Wrap-up is for anything I couldn't find another place for. One last thing before we begin. Due to its long-running status and the changing landscape of culture over the several decades the show has been running for, The Simpsons deals with a variety of issues, including substance abuse, suicide, sexual assault, talking dogs, and various flavors of bigotry. While I make strong attempts in this script to sanitize my language for an easier viewing experience, neither I nor the show stray away from discussion on these topics, and as such, listener discretion is advised. The Simpsons Shorts. The Simpsons began life as a sketch hastily produced in the waiting room of TV producer James L. Brooks's office. Matt Groening originally planned on pitching shorts for his comic series Life in Hell, but when he realized on the spot that doing so would require him to lose the license to what was, at the time, his life's work, he instead created crude sketches of his family, with only a few alterations, and sent that off instead. The concept was approved, and 48 one-minute episodes were aired over the following 3 seasons of Tracey Ullman's sketch show. As much as I'd like to individually review each one, it would probably take more time to recap the shorts than it would to simply watch them on their own, and since this is a retrospective on the evolution of the show over the years, it's thankfully not necessary to go to such an extent. The initial art style was very rough. Groening sent simple drawings to the animation team with the assumption that they would be cleaned up in post, but the animator simply drew over his sketches exactly. George Pelusi came up with the idea to make the family yellow-skinned, a decision meant to make the family stand out to people who were rapidly flipping through channels much for the same reason that taxis are yellow, so they too stand out among cars on a busy street. These combined to give the show the iconic cartoonish look that popped out in a way that brought viewers in, while the relatability of the family's dysfunction is what kept audiences engaged. And of course, the one major change to The Simpsons that many other shows had yet to adopt was the fact that the lines were recorded in sessions with all the voice cast present. This gave the lines a much more natural delivery, and allowed for the voice talent to put in much more personality to their characters. For example, while Dan Castellaneta originally portrayed Homer as similar to actor Walter Matthau, he later gave the character a much more distinct personality, which we're familiar with today. Content-wise, the family only vaguely resembles the one we collectively grew up with. Bart is, as always, up to antics of various kinds, but these tend to be much more pedestrian than what we know him for. Think trying to get out of church or stealing a cookie from a cookie jar, more so than chopping the head off of a statue. Homer is defined much more by his anger, but this anger is almost always directed at Bart, who is ostensibly the main character at the expense of everybody else. Lisa and Marge get very little in terms of agency and are mostly just accessories to stories, submitted into plots when necessary. Only Maggie really stays unchanged between these shorts and the show proper, even if there is quite a bit more slapstick at her expense. Season 1. Even from the first season, The Simpsons has always been an icon of counterculture, specifically made in response to what Groening referred to as mainstream trash, shows where families loved each other and a tight moral was taught at the end of each episode. The way the show ultimately presented itself adhered rather closely to this formula, in that most episodes would end with the family ultimately doing some sort of act where they prove that they really do love each other after all. In fact, structurally, The Simpsons is not very different from any other sitcoms of its era when reduced down to its core elements. The primary way by which it separates itself is through how those stories are told. The Simpsons aren't a family that has it all by any standard, and their struggles tend to be much more relatable as a result. Many episodes revolve around some kind of financial hardship or social issue, where a Simpson doesn't fit into polite society in some way. Homer has a dead-end job, Marge is dissatisfied with her domestic life, Lisa's intelligence is being wasted, Maggie is growing up in the middle of all this dysfunction, and Bart, well, we love Bart. And then with all of this struggle, the family comes together at the end of each day and argues and fights. It's far from the wholesome values and feel-good narratives that defined the 1980s, but those were never truly meant to represent the average American family, just the typical one. Because every single family is weird and misfit for our world. Nobody's family is normal, we all just pretend to be that way around others. And so to see a show airing that pulled back the curtain and showed off just how grating the regular lifestyle glorified by the media could be, meant that for the first time in a long while, Americans got to realize that, no, their dysfunction didn't make them wrong. It was the concept of conformity that forced them into feeling that way. And that's not a bad thing by any means, especially when there's just enough love to keep the family afloat from plot to plot. Just because Homer strangles Bart every few episodes doesn't mean that he doesn't love the boy, just as much as we can fight with our siblings, just as much as we fight for them. Simpsons roasting on an open fire. The Simpsons are preparing for Christmas, with all the traditions associated. But there's a hitch when it's time for the Christmas shopping, as Homer didn't receive his bonus that year, and Marge had to spend much of their savings removing a tattoo Bart got. But without the heart to tell his wife and his family about their dire financial straits, made worse by Marge's judgmental sisters being present, Homer decides to do everything in his power to make sure that the family gets a proper Christmas. Down to working as a mall Santa, and even getting convinced to gamble what meager earnings he's gotten. But his bets on the dog track don't pay off, and he winds up penniless, until the dog he bet on scrambles over, having been abandoned for losing one too many times. When Homer realizes the dog is a loser just like him, he decides to give the mutt a home, and Christmas is saved. Financial troubles are a central theme of many of the episodes of The Simpsons, even from its inception, and to set an episode about money during the biggest spending season also helps to reinforce one of the show's primary themes. That of the commodification of feel-good stories that required a show like The Simpsons to come along and satirize what we've been conditioned to expect. The idea of a TV family that always consumes as much as is healthy was starting to have a genuine straining effect on people's perceptions of their lives. We even see Homer lamenting that his next-door neighbor, Ned Flanders, has a better, and of course more expensive, Christmas display than he does. When the end-all example of success is how much money you can waste showing off that success, there will be an urge to overspend on appearances while neglecting what really matters. Originally meant to be the 8th episode of a season that began airing in fall 1989, many of the episodes were sent back due to animation errors and the show was postponed, with this Christmas special being the first episode to air instead of the intended order. This is why Santa's Little Helper doesn't appear in later episodes before being untriumphantly brought back. But for a show like The Simpsons, it's not a big damaging factor to lack a proper introduction episode in the way that many other sitcoms might have. Picking up in medias res is fine, as The Simpsons are a stand-in for America. You don't need to be introduced to your own family, and you don't need to be introduced to The Simpsons. Bart the Genius. After cheating on an IQ test, Bart is labeled a genius by the school system, and, combined with an enthusiasm to get him out of his hair, Principal Skinner has the boy reassigned to another school, one that can better accommodate his genius. Feeling guilty that they never quite encouraged Bart the way they thought he needed, Marge and Homer make a more active effort to find family activities that can nurture Bart's intellect. He enjoys the resulting quality time with his family and looks forward to the gifted school, where he's promised freedom from things like grades and expectations. But he predictably fails to acclimate to the new environment and finds that his old friends no longer want to spend time with him either. Realizing that the gifted school was not the easy life he imagined it to be, Bart admits to his fraud and is soon transferred back, much to the anger of Homer. It's a bit shocking how universal it is to feel as though the education system has left you behind. No matter your circle, you'll find anecdotes about schools doing too little to prepare students for life's problems, or doing too much and failing to retain interest. The fact that schools seem to leave behind so many children is, I think, more indicative of a failure to measure success than anything else. We try so hard to apply some sort of objective standard to childhood development, with no accommodations for any sort of deviance, that we end up creating something so generic that no one sane could possibly conform to it. The only thing a test in school measures is your ability to take tests. This episode introduces us to the opening sequence that would later become nearly as iconic as the show it was preceding. As with most shows, it was a means of cutting animation-related costs by recycling footage, though Lisa's sax solo, Bart's chalkboard punishment, and the now immortalized couch gag give each opening a little bit more variation to retain viewer attention. We also see an imagination spot from Bart, a look into his head as his overactive imagination extrapolates a situation to an extreme point. This was something that remained from the initial Tracy Ullman sketches, and is something that continues on for seasons to come, alongside such other staples as Lisa's unappreciated genius and Maggie's unnoticed genius. Homer's Odyssey. Homer tries to show off to Bart on the latter's school field trip to the nuclear plant, but accidentally causes yet another accident, resulting in his termination. After failing to bounce back, he goes to a local bridge to drown himself, only to instead get appalled by the lack of a stop sign, which almost gets his concerned family injured when they rush out to stop him. This fury turns righteous, and he goes on a crusade to improve the safety of the town, a crusade that culminates in him taking on the biggest threat to everybody's well-being, the nuclear plant. Fearing the crowd of followers Homer has gathered, Mr. Burns invites his former employee back with the new job as safety inspector, on the condition that he tells the crowd that the plant is safe. Wanting to provide for his family again, he reluctantly accepts, only to be shocked by the crowd's cheers as they view his crusade as coming to a fitting end. Another financially driven episode, Homer loses his job and ability to support his family, forcing Marge to work a demeaning job and crushing his dignity as he sinks to stealing Bart's piggy bank for beer money. Because despite all of his failures throughout his life, Homer has always succeeded where it really mattered, as a provider. The amount of respect he gets from those around him, be they friend or family, varies wildly, but the fact that they've got a roof over their head and a man willing to do anything to keep it there is one thing that he's always been very consistent on. Homer loses not only his ability to provide shelter for his family, but the basic level of security that comes as a part of that. When he steals Bart's money, he sinks to a low beneath the man who simply cannot provide, becoming a leech on their happiness instead. And so he's able to find some purpose to his life again through community work, making his city safer and not only protecting his family but everybody else's. If he can't be a provider, he can at least serve some small role as a guardian. And in the end, it's this single-minded determination to retain some level of dignity as a man that gets him his old job back. Mr. Burns is shocked by Homer's respect for all things safety-related, and that he's willing to put his old paycheck behind his ideals. But it's not really the concept of safety that Homer cared about, but his dignity, something that, while still negotiable, at the very least has a higher price than anything else. There's no disgrace like home. The Simpson family embarrasses themselves in front of Mr. Burns at a work function, causing Homer to lament at his family's poor behavior compared to how he thinks they should act. After failing to get them in line himself, he soon sees a solution on TV, to sign the family up for group therapy. It's costly and requires Homer to pawn the television set to afford it, but once they're sat down for their session, chaos breaks out, and soon Dr. Marvin Monroe is forced to eject the family, as they're scaring off his other customers. He refunds double their money, as per his ad, and the Simpsons celebrate that they're going to buy a much nicer TV with their dysfunction money. You can tell that this was a very early episode. Bart and Lisa are equally hellions compared to their later diverging behaviors. Marge is a wino, and Homer ends up being the voice of reason. Seeing Homer pawn the TV set is enough of a shock to a later season viewer that something is amiss with these characters, and that something is their lacking development over the early installments. Homer and Bart were the main characters, obviously so, as Bart was Matt Groening's self-stand-in, as the family was based on his own, and Homer was the main character who most closely resembled his own life. It took some time for anybody else to receive development, but when they did, the show was able to branch out significantly more in what sort of stories it could tell, and eventually managed to surpass the bounds of realism entirely. But that's not to say that this episode exists purely within the realm of realism either. There's a certain sense of exaggeration to everything that happens. Mr. Burns is cartoonishly self-centered and megalomaniacal. Granted, he is a cartoon character, and the therapy style of Dr. Marvin Monroe is something out of a pseudo-scientific health magazine. And yet, while these exaggerations give the show a sense of grandeur to plots that are still rather civilian, they're all derived from very real and very relatable character traits and aspects of society. Maybe we've never beaten our family members with a metal bar, but we've certainly all fought before, and maybe if you embarrass your family at a social function, there's some implications for your standing in that social circle, but it's uncommon that your boss would fire you over something so petty. And so I think this summarizes The Simpsons as a whole. Springfield is an insane town full of exaggerations and satirizations of our society, but sometimes seeing something blown up to be larger than life is the only way we can truly recognize it for what it is. Bart the General. Bart defends Lisa from a bully only for that bully to be a friend of Nelson Muntz's, the head bully in the schoolyard. Nelson beats up Bart repeatedly, with various Simpsons giving him input on how to repel the assaults. But his lesson in outreach from Marge is too optimistic to be useful, and his self-defense lessons from Homer prove too ineffective. Lisa suggests he go to Grandpa Simpson for advice on toughness, and Abe redirects him to an old war buddy, Herman. Herman teaches Bart how to lead men, and Bart is able to rally the victims of Nelson's bullying into a military unit that's able to fight back. A very Bart-centric storyline, indicative of the early style of the show, where Bart was the main character before the ensemble cast gained more of the spotlight. This episode doesn't really stand out in any meaningful way. The charm The Simpsons would later have, insofar as its subversive nature and satirization, isn't really present yet, and this episode plays out like more of a schoolyard fantasy than a sitcom plot. That said, there are still quite a few decent jabs at mainstream television that still make it clever enough to stand among the rest of the show. After a lengthy bit involving Homer teaching Bart to aim for the, quote, family jewels, we get to a scene where Grandpa Simpson serves as a mark to exemplify many of the showrunner's gripes with the modern media landscape that explicitly calls out this language. Because at the time, an episode like Bart the General was actually pretty subversive. The level of violence, themes of warfare, and the language used was something rare to see in post-Hays Code era network television, and managed to stir up some controversy. So while early Simpsons is very tame by our standards, it's less indicative of the show becoming watered down as it goes on, but rather, our standards becoming more accepting of media that might offend. Moaning Lisa. Lisa lands herself in a depressive funk, too sad to argue with her family or participate in school. Marge tries to pass on knowledge from her childhood to Lisa, to force yourself to smile and repress your feelings of sadness, but this hardly helps. What does aid her search for meaning is when she hears the sounds of Bleedin' Gums Murphy, a passing jazz man who jams with her to help with self-expression. But Marge worries about the influence of strange musicians and tries to reinforce her lessons to her daughter, telling Lisa to continue forcing down her emotions until Marge sees the stifling mentality of her daughter's peers and teachers. In the end, she tells Lisa it's okay to be sad and that her family won't think any less of her for it. And then they all go out to watch Bleedin' Gums perform live. In the B-plot, Homer can't beat Bart in a video game, so he takes lessons from a child. If any character best represents what it means to be a Simpson, it's Lisa, the one who never fit in with the rest of the world, who seemed to be too self-aware for her own good, the one whose interests and personality caused her to stand out among her peers and become derided for that. In a show that captured what it really meant to be an outsider among a schmaltzy, commodified society, Lisa is the character who best encapsulates what it feels like to be the only sane person in an insane world, and then to feel like you're the crazy one. Although perhaps that's an inaccurate statement. It isn't that the world is crazy and you're sane, it's that the world is insane but pretending that it's not. And so being the weird one should mean that you fit in even better when the opposite happens instead. Everybody who's crazy is crazy in a different way, so it can feel like you're the outsider no matter what. But the truth is that all of the random people you encountered who seem to have it together are just really good at faking it. Get talking to any normal person out there, and you'll soon find that they're just as weird as you are, just in a different way that you might not recognize at first. And so Lisa learns to express herself through music, because there's no way for a misfit to make connections with another person if they don't, and she manages to find her niche, as well as her happiness. The Call of the Simpsons. Jealous of the Flanders' new RV, Homer takes his family to buy a bigger and better one, but they end up getting whatever's in their price range instead. This turns out to be a piece of junk that Homer ends up driving off of a cliff in the wilderness, leaving the family stranded in the middle of the woods. But not wanting to admit defeat, Homer takes Bart with him to find civilization, while Marge and Lisa stay behind to make camp, and Maggie gets abducted by bears. But Homer and Bart wind up even more lost than before, and when Homer loses his clothes, gets stung by bees and covered in mud, a local wildlife videographer discovers him, and the footage convinces America that Bigfoot is real. Park rangers soon find the rest of the family, and Homer is taken in to be examined before scientists conclude that he's either a very dim-witted man or a brilliant beast. This is another of the old-school cutesy episodes, the type that has the same appeal as series like Charlie Brown, where you're meant to watch the family and point out how similar the antics of the characters are to some loved one you know. Isn't it funny how Homer refuses to ask for directions? Aren't his ape-like behaviors similar to insert monkeyish relative here? Wasn't it cute when Maggie gave her pacifier to the bear? It's the type of humor and substance one might expect to see in an email chain suburban moms send back and forth to each other. But simple episodes like this provide a broader appeal to the show and let The Simpsons reach more of the family, certainly a contributing factor to its longevity. Ultimately, though, this episode comes across as one of the weakest of the season. The three plot threads all seem to exist independently of each other, as though one were setting up the next, but to no real climax. They could have done an episode on the family taking an RV trip, or being lost in the woods, or Homer being mistaken for a scientific anomaly. But in the end, it comes across as not knowing which bit worked best and resulting in none of them truly standing out. The Telltale Head. The story begins in medias res, with Homer and Bart running from an angry mob while carrying the head of the statue of Jebediah Springfield. Before the mob can disembowel them both, Bart pleads to tell his story, and the episode flashes back to the previous Sunday, where Homer listens to a football game during church while Bart bothers the Sunday school teacher with inane questions. After church, Bart decides to see a movie and is peer-pressured into a crime spree by a group of miscreants. Hoping to impress his new friends, Bart gets the idea into his head to vandalize the statue of the town's founder. But when this doesn't earn the respect of anybody, but rather the hatred of the entire town, he begins to feel guilty about the entire thing, and soon rushes to return the head, only for the story to catch up to him. In the end, though, the angry mob is pacified enough to forgive him, and all ends well. Possibly the most iconic early episode of The Simpsons, the Telltale Head is a combination of that slice-of-life aesthetic, cynical sarcasm, and a feel-good ending that makes up many of the greatest moments of the show's run. Bart vandalizing a beloved statue in an attempt to fit in is such a human story, and that act of acting out to fit in is something that we can all empathize with. Who hasn't acted out for attention as a child? And in the end, the crowd is able to understand why Bart did what he did and realize that the whole incident has not only made them appreciate the statue more, but also brought them closer together in their hatred of him. Of course, this all goes with the lampshading of Homer, as he mentions in the episode's final line that not all lynch mobs are this nice. This episode not only marks one of the early glimpses of the show's future potential, but also introduces so many different Springfieldianites that will become a part of the larger cast in the future. The trio of Dolph, Kearney, and Jimbo make their first appearance here, serving the typical role of bully/negative influence for Bart. Krusty appears for the first time outside of the Ullman shorts, standing alongside Sideshow Bob. Reverend Lovejoy, too, gets to make a hypocritical sermon, as is his typical usage in the show. He preaches the evils of gambling, while the sign outside the church advertises a bingo night, Monte Carlo night, and a trip to Reno. Although that's admittedly something that I got out of the complete guide to seasons 1 through 8, as my copy is the old standard definition one, and so some of the gags I mentioned don't appear legible. Life on the Fast Lane. It's Marge's birthday, but Homer has forgotten to buy a gift, made worse when the last-minute gift he does get her is a bowling ball, with Homer's name engraved on it. Marge sees through his excuses and deduces that the ball was a gift for himself, so out of spite, she decides to learn to bowl. While learning, she eventually meets a man named Jacques, who tries to seduce her under the guise of teaching her the sport. Meanwhile, Homer tries to keep his kids happy as Marge spends more and more time out bowling, before he eventually falls into a depressive slump over his failing marriage. But when a final gesture of kindness reaches Marge, she realizes the mistake she's making, and the two finally make up. If financial struggles are the most common driving factor behind The Simpsons' plot lines, marriage troubles are a close second. The tumultuous and at times questionable nature of Marge and Homer's union is a constant source of drama from which plots can be derived. The fact that the relationship is one that isn't always happy or peaceful only adds to the relatability that made early Simpsons so culturally resonant. So many sitcoms had to have domestic relationships that panned out alright no matter what. No matter what arguments occurred, everything wrapped up nicely in the end. But in The Simpsons, that was rarely the case. Just because Homer and Marge argue and then make up doesn't mean that the issue is completely gone and behind them. Even if Homer is an inconsiderate gift giver at times, a few good actions won't make that all better, but neither will a single bad one. Marge is heavily tempted to cheat on Homer in this episode, but in the end she refuses to. Not only because she's trying to set a better example for her kids and sees her overcompensation, but because she doesn't want to stoop to the same level as him. Two wrongs won't make a right, and in the end, one wrong doesn't necessarily make a relationship worth throwing away. Because while Homer might not be the best person for Marge, he's far from the worst, and so she decides to take charge and let the high points of their relationship define it rather than the worst. Homer's Night Out. Bart buys a spy camera off of a magazine and uses it to take subtle snapshots of various members of the Simpson household, culminating in him taking a picture of Homer dancing with Princess Cashmere during a stag party. The image goes 1990s viral and soon finds its way into everybody's radar, but this has disastrous consequences for Homer's marriage when Marge confronts him over the picture. He's kicked out for the night and spends the next several hours being lauded as a ladies' man, but he just wants his relationship back. And so Marge demands that Homer set a better example for Bart by taking him to meet this Princess Cashmere and showing him how she isn't just an object to ogle, but a real person. Unfortunately, Homer's timing is off, and he ends up on stage at a burlesque performance. But after a bit of dancing, he comes to his senses and gives an impassioned speech on respecting woman that results in everything returning to normal. One of the most defining traits of early Homer Simpson is the fact that, although he's a thoroughly flawed character, he constantly makes efforts to fix his issues, even if it does take some extreme circumstance to get to the point where he admits that he has a problem. So while Homer may set a bad example for his son by neglecting Marge's interests when birthday shopping or getting too crazy at a bachelor party, When he realizes the consequences of his actions, he always goes out of his way to ensure that he's fixed whatever wrong he's created. This is, I think, the fundamental difference between past iterations of Homer and what later season detractors would eventually call jerk-ass Homer. Because it isn't as though he was once a shining beacon of morality who steadily became a sociopath. It was that he began feeling less and less remorse for his actions. Or rather, it's safer to say that what remorse he does feel comes across as insincere. We can only see Homer mess up and then fix the mess so many times before it starts to become an issue that he's no longer learning from his past mistakes. How many times does he need to almost cheat on his wife before we realize that the apology at the end of the episode is forced only in the interest of keeping the status quo intact? And while his behavior surely does change between seasons depending on who's in the writer's room, there's only so much that can be added to the greater scope of his character before any future morals or lessons become diluted. The Crepes of Wrath. After crippling his father and blowing up Principal Skinner's mother, the Simpson parents agree to send Bart on an exchange program, if not to teach him some worldliness and respect, at the very least to get him out of their hair for a few months. He's sent to France while the Simpson family gets an Albanian boy named Adil. Adil quickly becomes a beloved member of the Simpson family, helping out around the house, debating with Lisa, and even taking a keen interest in Homer's work at the nuclear plant, which of course turns out to be a ploy to get pictures of the reactors and send them back home to his hostile nation. Meanwhile, Bart is worked ragged by his adoptive family, who treat him like a slave and give his lucky red hat to the donkey. When he catches them putting antifreeze in the wine, Bart runs into town where he encounters an officer of the law, and, in perfect French, manages to report the deeds of the criminals. This is another episode that puts Bart's intelligence into the spotlight. While he's a slacker in many ways, he also shows a proficiency for learning French incredibly quickly, despite the principal believing he would behave otherwise. This, coupled with an episode like Moaning Lisa, shows how a vague system of education can let down so many students by not properly pandering to particular needs. Bart is clearly gifted, he just puts his energy into less practical uses like pranks and hijinks, rather than attempting to learn anything for class. Lisa likewise has a very different approach to knowledge that, while more useful for retaining information in the way schools intend for her to do, is equally stifled by the environment of education. This is probably the episode of The Simpsons that aged the fastest. Albania was under communist rule at the time of its airing, but only 8 months later shifted power away from the system villainized in this episode. Today, Albania is a part of NATO and is therefore an ally of the US. It's not as though an episode is made worse by being dated in this way, though. Part of the appeal of early Simpsons is the ability to take a glimpse into older pop culture and to see how we were those decades ago. So while the actual content of the episode might have become irrelevant, the general zeitgeist around the time period is still preserved, like an artifact in a museum. Krusty gets busted. While shopping for a visit from Patty and Selma, Homer witnesses Bart's hero, Krusty the Clown, robbing a convenience store. The story circulates the news cycle, and Bart is devastated at the news, as they recount Krusty's career, his rise, and his fall. But Bart doesn't lose faith in the clown and asks for Lisa's help in getting to the bottom of the mystery of who framed Krusty. They're able to conclude from archived footage and the CCTV tapes that Krusty couldn't have done it, but don't have a suspect in mind until the Simpsons kids are placed on the air of the Sideshow Bob show, where Krusty's former assistant has turned the old show into a spectacle of culture. There, Bart pieces the last few bits of the puzzle together and announces to the live audience that it was Sideshow Bob who framed the clown. Bob is arrested, and Bart gets validation for never giving up on his hero. This episode is our introduction to the world of Krusty and Sideshow Bob, two characters who would later go on to receive a remarkable amount of attention from the showrunners as they independently get a series of plot lines in development that manage to expand the show's world and area of satirization. Krusty's subplots are nearly always about the media cycle and the effect of fame on an individual. Even here, we see how the news is able to spin a story into a grand public spectacle that turns so much of society against their former idol. And as per usual, it's the Simpson family embroiled in the countercultural pushback against the topic. Because while newscasters represent the normal side of the world, tearing into one of their own, Bart still holds fast to his convictions. surprisingly one of the only people with the morals to do so, even if those morals are a bit tainted by his unwillingness to accept the situation. And on the other hand, we also get to see one of the most accomplished and beloved of the regular guest stars on the show, as Kelsey Grammer steals every single scene he's in with his portrayal of Sideshow Bob. Bob himself is the erudite counterpart to Krusty, the high society sort of individual who, like the Simpsons, also seems to want to separate himself from the lowest common denominator of society, just in the opposite direction. In this way, Bob and Bart make excellent counterparts to one another. While Bob is a member of the countercultural movement of intellectuals who view themselves as above the rest of the world, Bart is the type who exists in parallel to society, not fitting in due to his different philosophies and behavior rather than taste and culture. Some Enchanted Evening. Marge gets the idea that she's underappreciated from a talk show radio therapist, as well as the fact that she is underappreciated. And when Homer hears her call in, he turns to Moe for advice, where he gets an idea of his own to wine and dine her to rekindle their relationship. While out, they hire a babysitter for their kids, though they don't get the luxury of being choosy with the sitter and end up with Miss Botts, the current alias of the fugitive from the law, also known as the Babysitter Bandit. Bart and Lisa find out from a late-night crime show that their sitter is a criminal, and they work together with Maggie to apprehend her. But when Homer and Marge come home early from their night out with concerns after the phone isn't answered, Homer ends up untying the sitter and letting her go, just before the police arrive. This episode was originally intended to air first, but when it was sent back from the Korean animation studio, the showrunners found a considerable number of errors that resulted in a firmer hand being used to check for poor quality animation throughout the rest of the season. This forced the series to be delayed enough that the Christmas special ended up airing first. It's a pretty common point of trivia that this episode's overly detailed animation is a sort of malicious compliance to the constant complaints about the low quality during the first several iterations. Originally, at the end of this episode, it was meant to be revealed that Marge had a pair of large bunny ears underneath her hair, a reference to Groening's Life in Hell series, but this was cut from the episode and from later seasons in favor of a more down-to-earth style. Likewise, Homer was originally meant to be Krusty the Clown, moonlighting as the TV personality to create a sort of dramatic irony, where Bart would disrespect his father at home while looking up to him on television. But in spite of the mini-cut plot, the season ultimately concluded on a much higher note than anybody expected, especially so given the troubled production, and The Simpsons was quickly catapulted into common culture. Some Enchanted Evening exists as the final weird Simpsons episode, the last point in time where the show still had corners to be ironed out and designs to solidify. As Season 1 ended, the experimental phase of writing and design did, too. Season 2. The first season of The Simpsons was only a slight departure from the original sketch comedies of the Tracy Ullman era. 1-minute segments designed to introduce an idea, crack a few jokes, and then wrap themselves up. And in the early seasons we can see this DNA remains. Most episodes are structured as a series of 1-minute gag sketches, with only a loose structure keeping them coherent. Going scene by scene through Season 1 will show you about a dozen 1-minute bits, with the occasional scene to connect the other threads in a logical way. But as the show developed, the writer's room began to evolve on this idea, giving the show a more coherent through line, as well as introducing more independent B and sometimes C plots. But those original sketch comedy roots remained, giving the humor a distinct feeling that most other shows were never quite able to capture, and I think this is what makes The Simpsons so quotable to this day. Season 1 had a tumultuous start, many episodes getting sent back to be reanimated, and the show getting a myriad complaints from teachers and concerned parents over the content, as well as the fact that the cast was far from ideal in terms of role models, despite how many young students were looking up to them. Bart Simpson t-shirts were banned from many grade schools, and there were calls to tone down the content considering the cartoonist style was attracting the attention of children. But part of the original contract with Fox included a clause to give Groening complete creative control over the series, meaning executive meddling had to be kept to a minimum. Although it's unknown just how much the network would have actually interfered with the show that garnered as much success as The Simpsons, especially because the controversies were surely acting as a fantastic form of early viral advertising. Much of the early DNA of The Simpsons was derived from Groening's early work on Life in Hell, a series which primarily focused on the artist venting his frustrations with his life. These gripes continued on to make many of the early shorts from The Tracy Ullman Show up through the early seasons much more relatable to audiences, as they were able to relate to the petty inconveniences of the cast and laugh at their mutual disdain for the frivolous nonsense that made up modern culture. But as The Simpsons grew bigger, so too did the ambition behind the show, and soon the plots began to take on a much less plausible tone. While the series was always grounded in realism, we start to see a lot less of the sitcom-y hijinks the family was used to, and a lot more jumping over gorges and three-eyed fish, as the show came more into its own. Bart gets an F. After failing a book report due to not having read the book, Bart is warned of a major exam coming up and that it will affect his future. But when he slacks off at home instead of studying and fails yet again, a parent-teacher conference is called where the suggestion to have Bart repeat the 4th grade is floated. This serves as a wake-up call, and Bart declares his intention to study properly. He fails yet again, but prays for another opportunity, something that is granted when a sudden snow day occurs. Not wanting to waste this miracle, Bart spends the whole night forcing himself to read, slapping himself to stay awake, and when the day of the test finally comes, he finds that he has failed it once again. He bursts into tears, lamenting that he really tried this time and still managed not to succeed, although a last-minute analogy involving applied history gives his teacher, Miss Krabappel, enough of an excuse to give Bart a few pity points that prevent him from being held back. This is one of the most important episodes of the show for Bart's development as a character and portrayal as a human being, because while he managed a reputation outside the world of The Simpsons as a larger-than-life mimetic figure, within the world there needed to be some sort of grounding plot to humanize the boy. He exuded the aura of a slacker, the type who is too cool for school, and yet this is really just a defense mechanism to avoid the inevitable rejection by the more polite sectors of society. None of the major characters of The Simpsons fit into what society expects of them, and so in Bart's case he acts as though he doesn't care. But not caring is a difficult thing to do when an entire world seems to be locked off to you, purely because of who you are as a person. And in this case, his ennui with the normal world causes issues when he's told he has to repeat the 4th grade. So Bart is forced to study, to return to that which he has so far rejected, and he fails. It's fitting that the ancillary plot to this episode revolves around Martin, a character who has likewise been rejected by society, learning to fit in with the other bad kids, and soon finding a sense of acceptance similar to what Bart had before. To compare the two's journeys would imply that Bart, if he were as accomplished as his peers, could easily achieve a similar level of success. But years of resenting an activity will make you ill-adjusted to that world, as Bart learns harshly in this episode. Simpson and Delilah. Homer tries a miracle breakthrough in hair growth called Demoxenil, though it's too expensive to buy outright, so he has to charge it to his company insurance policy. It works, and he soon finds himself happier and more easily getting along with those around him. This new attitude also attracts the attention of Mr. Burns, who promotes Homer to junior executive, with all of the money and perks that come with the title. He hires a new assistant, Carl, who helps him continue in his upward trajectory. But the new attention from Burns is making Mr. Smithers jealous, and the former right-hand man looks for dirt on the newly dude Simpson, discovering his frivolous insurance claim. Homer loses his hair and nearly loses his job, too, but Carl gives him a pep talk that all the recent greatness was a part of him all along, and he never needed the full head of hair to achieve it. Though the rest of the world doesn't see it that way, and soon Homer is reduced to his old bald loser self, only getting his old job back out of pity, as Mr. Burns too struggled with male pattern baldness. A very Simpson-esque plot, where a typical sitcom cliché is set up, exaggerated, and then deconstructed as it clashes against a world not as prepared to let things resolve happily just because a family hugged in the end. Of course, the intended lesson is that Homer never needed the hair to regain his confidence, and that it was all something that he had all along. But since all his promotions and accolades were merely the result of the rest of the world making a shallow observation, of course it would all go away just as easily. We're conditioned to expect a happy ending, where Homer exudes a newly learned confidence, and we're actually given just that. It's not just the character arcs that are inverted, it's the world's reaction to these arcs too. Homer maintains a high level of confidence, but the nuclear plant executives still turn their back on him regardless, showing just how indifferent society is to deeper character growth. This is the first real experience the Simpsons writers have shown with a gay character, although to their own insistence, Carl was never explicitly written as homosexual. While the guest star, Harvey Fierstein, is an open advocate for LGBT rights, Groening is recorded as stating that the character of Carl is, quote, whatever the audience wants him to be. Despite being one of the earliest instances of homosexuality on television, it still manages to come across as more tasteful than many future failures would achieve by not reducing a character to their gayness in exception of anything else. Future episodes, most notably Homer's Phobia, would approach the topic in a similar, albeit much less closeted way. But the episode Simpson and Delilah shows that it wasn't just about waiting until it was more socially acceptable to approach the issue, but being proactive in the pursuit of that equality. Treehouse of Horror I. A series of short vignettes told with the framing device of Bart and Lisa exchanging scary stories in their treehouse while Homer listens in. The first is a parody of the Amityville Horror, the Simpsons moving into a house possessed by the vengeful spirits from an Indian burial ground. After the voices convince the family to attack each other with knives, Marge grows angry and demands the house to parley with them. Ultimately, it decides to vanish into nothingness rather than continue living with the Simpsons. The second is a parody of the Galaxy science fiction story To Serve Man, and its later Twilight Zone counterpart. It introduces us to the Rigelians, who abduct the Simpsons from their home and prepare to transport them to their home planet of Rigel 4. But Lisa grows suspicious of their motives and discovers a cookbook called How to Cook Humans, which is later revealed to actually be titled How to Cook for 40 Humans. The Rigelians, disgusted by the mistrusting nature of the family, drop the Simpsons off back at home, denying them an existence in paradise. In the third tale, Lisa reads Edgar Allan Poe's story The Raven, with various members of the Simpson household taking the roles of the characters within, reading their lines and internal monologues in a segment that you probably watched in your grade school English class. The Treehouse of Horror segments have been a staple of The Simpsons for nearly as long as the show has been around, and even from the very early stages, we can see that they've always been an excuse for the writers to exercise their parody muscles. Because while The Simpsons has always been a stylistic parody of so many other genres, this is the first opportunity to make an outright homage to various other media works. Two cars in every garage and three eyes on every fish. After a story breaks about a three-eyed fish swimming in one of the nuclear waste depositories near the Springfield nuclear plant, there are calls to shut down the plant after it fails several inspections. Lamenting the heavy cost of meeting the bare minimum safety standards, Mr. Burns is sobbing in his car when Homer accidentally puts the idea into his head to run for governor, so that the standards can be relaxed. He hires a crack team of media manipulators to skyrocket through the polls by telling Americans what they want to hear. And this causes a rift in the Simpson family household as they tear themselves between Burns and the incumbent. This culminates in a publicity stunt, where Burns dines with the Simpson family to appeal more to the common voter, which backfires when Marge serves the three-eyed fish from before as the main course. Burns chokes on the fish, chokes in the polls, and smashes up a few things before storming off. We saw a glimpse of this in the previous episode with the Raven parody section, but the one thing that The Simpsons excels at is taking a higher concept storytelling device and simplifying it so that a general audience can understand and appreciate them. Whether it's a mid-19th century poem on the inevitability of grief, or a modern retelling of Citizen Kane, The Simpsons is able to dumb down just about anything to the point that even a child can pick up on the general idea. And so this leads to an increase in culture by serving as a kicking off point for young, curious viewers. I mentioned in the last episode's review that many grade school English classes viewed the Treehouse of Horror I segment for fun, but there's a very good reason as to why. It's accessible. In this way, The Simpsons has always managed to have a much deeper meaning to its otherwise very basic comedic premises, and as a result, is something that a wide range of viewers can find enjoyment in. It's funny and a bit depressing how little this episode has aged despite airing back in 1990. At the forefront are environmental concerns, political corruption, and how our desire to consume lies at the center of it all. And a cute three-eyed fish named Blinky can guide us through these issues as we watch the cast themselves navigate the murky waters. How many families debated issues in just the same way we saw Lisa and Homer discuss their beliefs? And how much of common society do we see in the town of Springfield, and how easily manipulated they are by the grand speeches and posturing by a man who wants nothing more than for them to vote against their own self-interest so that he might continue to poison them for his own economic gain. It's almost a bit reassuring to see that these issues were present in the minds of Americans over 3 decades ago, as if to see that, no, the world's not getting worse, it's just as stupid as it's always been. Dancin Homer. Homer tells the barflies at Moe's Tavern a story of his rise and fall as the mascot of the Springfield Isotopes, the local minor league baseball team. It starts with him on a company baseball night, sitting next to Mr. Burns and getting drunk enough to start making a public spectacle of himself. But the laughs and cheers of the enthusiastic crowd are enough to get the Isotopes out of a long losing streak, and soon he's offered a part-time job dancing in the dugouts to keep the crowds interested. This culminates in a big break to Capital City, where Homer is able to take his Dancin Homer act to the big leagues. After his family packs up and makes the big move, he's nervous about performing in front of a much larger crowd. These nerves are justified when he's eventually given a completely lukewarm reception at the Major League game and soon goes back to Springfield in failure, although his friends seem to love the story of his fall, so it's not all bad. There exists a concept of a Simpsons golden age, a period of time where the show was at its comedic and cultural peak, marked by the persistence in everything the show is lauded for today. And while debate exists online as to whether Season 2 is included in that label, there's no doubt that this episode stands among the show's peak, at least stylistically. We get some properly quotable moments, such as Homer's declaration that a baseball ticket gives him the right and the duty to make an ass of himself, and the bizarre throwaway humor that would mark many of the peak seasons' gags, such as the existence of the ex-wives sections at the baseball game. This episode also explores what made The Simpsons so culturally resonant with a certain self-awareness that's rarely seen even today. Marge calling out the absurdity of a Simpson on a t-shirt plays into the Bart mania that had gripped the nation at the time of the episode's airing, and the episode wraps up with Homer pontificating on how a story of a person's humiliation and failure can cause that person to become more endearing in the eye of the audience. His popularity with the barflies at Moe's mirrors the popularity of The Simpsons with Western audiences. We don't tune in to watch the story of a success having everything we could never have, but to see an everyman squander the opportunity in a way that the average person can relate to. Dead Pudding Society. Homer gets into a spat with Ned Flanders over his perception that the Flanderses have everything nicer than the Simpsons. Hoping not to have a feud between the two, Ned attempts to reconcile the situation, but the Simpson family scorns this peace offering, and Homer challenges Ned to a miniature golf competition between their sons, fighting as a proxy for their dispute. Homer tries to force Bart to master the mini art of mini golf, but as he's a bad teacher, Lisa offers her services instead. Meanwhile, the feud between Ned and Homer heats up, and they up the ante, so that the loser must mow the winner's lawn in his wife's Sunday dress. Lisa ends up giving Bart the mental edge that he needs to win, and the competition comes to a close draw. But rather than carrying on their father's feud, they instead agree to call the tourney a tie, and, due to some specific wording, both Homer and Ned end up performing the punishment. There exists within the baby boomer generation a weird obsession with simultaneously fitting into society as much as possible, while also standing out more than anyone else. Being different is bad, but being better is okay. In fact, being better than your neighbor is the only way to possibly differentiate yourself from them without being looked down upon. It's as though a trophy exists as the ultimate sign of conformity, a Most Fit In award. This is why that generation feels a general disdain towards the idea of a participation trophy. How are you supposed to be better than somebody without also putting someone else down? One aspect of The Simpsons explored in this episode is the generational split between Bart and Homer, also mirrored in Todd and Ned. That conformity for the sake of conformity and fitting in are valued differently between the two generations. While a baby boomer might want to have a house just like everyone else's but bigger, a car like everyone else's but faster, and a job like everyone else's but richer, the generation to follow them was much less interested in physical things that mark their accomplishments, and were much less likely to put stock in a reminder of their accomplishments compared to the accomplishment itself. So for example, a photo of a vacation rather than a souvenir. Bart versus Thanksgiving. The Simpson family celebrates Thanksgiving, bringing everybody together and having Lisa create a commemorative cornucopia. But Bart ends up throwing the centerpiece into the fireplace and, rather than apologize for the destruction, decides to run away from home. While on the streets, he looks for a way to get a free meal, eventually donating blood and passing out on the street. He's awoken by a couple of homeless men who take him to a local shelter, where they receive a free meal, and Bart ends up on a late-night guilt trip story on the news. He eventually returns home, climbing up to the roof as he still can't bring himself to apologize, until Lisa joins him up there and asks him to reconsider. The two make up, and Homer and Marge are relieved that they raised their kids well after all. The culture clash within the Simpsons household is one indicative of the two broader appeals of the show, as well as the potential for clashing between the two. While Lisa is an underappreciated overachiever, Bart is the overappreciated underachiever. Their feud comes down to a failure to appreciate one another. While Bart has always received the unconditional love of his parents, no matter how little he accomplishes, Lisa feels overshadowed, due to receiving the same attention despite doing so much more. It can feel like there's less love going her way, despite the extra needs her extra effort demands, and so it's difficult for Lisa to put herself into the shoes of her older brother when he fails to understand why her crafts mean so much to her. Not that I think this episode did an altogether great job of really showing off either side of this conflict. Bart was more or less entirely in the wrong in this situation, and yet we're expected to show some sort of sympathy for a boy who destroyed something and then refused to show any sort of remorse. And while he does show the early signs of guilt, it's far too little too late. Bart believes that he'll be over-punished for his misdeeds, and that apologizing is an acceptance of that fact. And while this can be chalked up to his overactive imagination, it's also equally indicative of a lack of maturity over interpersonal issues. But on the counterpoint, Bart is also a child. Bart the Daredevil. The Simpson family plans to attend a monster truck rally, but due to watching Lisa's recital beforehand, they show up late and their car is wrecked when Homer drives onto the pitch. But more importantly than that, Bart gets inspired by the acts of Captain Lance Murdoch, a local daredevil, and decides to pursue a career in death defiance. He gets fame among the neighborhood kids for a while before ultimately seeking a greater thrill, jumping Springfield Gorge. His parents try to talk him out of it, but Bart refuses to listen, so Homer ultimately takes it upon himself to jump the gorge in Bart's stead, if only to show him how stupid the idea is. His plan works, and Bart agrees never to risk his life pointlessly, but when Homer slips down the gorge by mistake, he winds up attempting to jump anyway, falling not once, but twice. Bartmania swept through the Western world practically overnight. The massive success of The Simpsons led to a deluge of school children desperately wanting to be more like their idol, a down-to-earth elementary schooler who nonetheless managed great adventures in a setting just like their hometown. This impressionability gave the writers an opportunity, as much as a responsibility, to give a proper lesson to children, as they would surely imitate anything they saw him do on television. But rather than simply trying to make Bart into a more upstanding moral character, they went for the other extreme, so as not to sell out. Bart became louder, prouder, and his stunts began to defy reality. After all, while kids may mimic his pranks and attitude, there was no way they'd be dumb enough to jump off a cliff just because a cartoon character did it. At a certain point, the lack of common sense has to be blamed on the parents. And this shift away from realism ended up paying off for the series. Many of the larger-than-life set-piece moments of The Simpsons managed to become just as popular as the heartfelt relatability of the first season. And all of this was presented in a way so as not to harm the other extreme. The Simpsons may get into insane, wacky antics, but at the end of the day, they're still human. Their faults just like ours, and their ambitions are the same. They merely have the opportunity to express those ambitions in more unique ways. We may not ever get the chance to jump a gorge on our skateboards, but we will certainly have an opportunity to make a public spectacle of ourselves for the entertainment of others. Itchy and Scratchy and Marge. Maggie hits Homer in the head with a hammer after getting the idea from an episode of Itchy and Scratchy. Realizing this, Marge starts a letter-writing campaign to reduce the amount of violence in cartoons. Despite the director of Itchy and Scratchy Studios believing that, quote, one screwball cannot make a difference, she persists, and eventually gathers the attention of more and more concerned parents, who eventually have enough of an impact on the Krusty the Clown show's ratings that the writers cave and remove violence from their cartoons. Unsatisfied with the lack of conflict in their shows, the children of Springfield go outside and partake in wholesome activities, with even Maggie beginning to take after the kinder, gentler TV characters. But when Michelangelo's David tours Springfield, the usual group of protesters tries to have Marge lead them in blocking the lewd statue from being shown in their museums. But Marge doesn't oppose the statue, and soon the world moves on from her crusading. Is The Simpsons art? Can anything with the express purpose of selling ad space on a right-wing news network really be considered high art, or is there something inherent to capitalist structure that prevents anything made to be consumed from entering the realm of art? If so, does that make the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, quote, not art, as it was painted on commission? The purpose of art is to stimulate the senses and force us to think about our relationship to the rest of the world. It's a means of seeing things through a perspective we may never be able to experience ourselves, and an appreciation of art can make us more well-rounded, thoughtful as a society. So if all of that is true of a TV show, can we then consider it artistry? And if we can't, have I wasted my entire life talking about TV shows? It's more likely than I'd like to think. Ultimately, this episode's narrative takes a strong anti-cartoon stance. When cartoons lose their comedic source, the children are shown to be nicer, more sociable, and better adjusted to the world. We get the impression that cartoons are some sort of evil influence on children, and this is of course all granted a major sense of irony in that it's a moral taught to us by a cartoon itself. And so the messaging of this episode is something that we're meant to take a more nuanced view on, purely because of the medium through which the message is relayed. If you think my videos are art, let me know in the comments below. If you don't, there's a good chance you've told me already. Bart gets hit by a car. Bart is struck by Mr. Burns' car while out on his skateboard. The injuries he sustains are minor, but Lionel Hutz, a shyster lawyer, notices the potential for a big payout and coaches the Simpsons on how to play up Bart's injuries so they can sue Mr. Burns for a bigger payout. The case makes it to court and the jury seems to be siding heavily on the side of the Simpsons, so Burns parlays with the family in the hopes of settling out of court. But when Homer's greed gets the better of him and he demands a higher payout, which causes Marge's conscience to hit a tipping point, she eventually points out her dislike for the shady lawyers and quack doctors. Mr. Burns overhears this point and formulates a new strategy to attack the Simpson family at their weakest point, Marge's sense of decency. His plan works, and the Simpson family loses the suit. Homer visits Moe in a depressed stupor, upset that his wife cost him such a large sum of money, but in the end, he can't stay mad at her and the two make up. The Simpsons have always portrayed a negative relationship between financial well-being and sense of morality. Far from the starving artist or the noble working class, there's a sense that practically any sudden acclamation of wealth is something inherently immoral to have. Mr. Burns is the richest man in Springfield, and he's constantly portrayed as a cartoonish villain, as if the only way you could possibly get that much money is by foregoing any sense of morals. Good people don't get rich. And we see the same temptation is given to the Simpson family as they get an opportunity to become rich if only they would lie to a courtroom to defraud a man, as wicked as he is, of his wealth. And so the conflict of this episode is less a battle between the classes, and more so a battle between the ideology of wealth. But more important than any of that, this episode marks the first appearance of a fan-favorite character and guest star in Lionel Hutz and his VA Phil Hartman. Hutz appears as a stereotype of the dirty lawyer, willing to do just about anything for a case, and allowing the writers to poke fun at the immoral potential of the legal system through his antics. He's the perfect example of a Simpsons side character, able to perform absurd actions that would never exist in the real world, but could. And as such, he is a spiritual incarnation of the show's philosophy as a whole, to exaggerate the mundane in order to draw better satire out of it. One fish, two fish, blowfish, bluefish. Wanting to try something outside their usual routine, the Simpson family goes to a sushi restaurant. Homer ends up eating just about everything on the menu, including fugu, or poisoned blowfish. The chefs have reason to believe it was improperly prepared, however, and Homer is soon told that he may have 24 hours to live. So he makes a bucket list, a series of things he wants to do before he dies. This includes things like a final goodbye to each of his children, telling off his boss, and making peace with his father. But due to a series of unforeseen developments, such as his father wanting to make up for lost time and him getting arrested, Homer ends up rushing the last of his list. But he makes it home in time for one last goodbye with Marge before he retires to the living room to pass peacefully. In the end, though, Homer survives the fish and vows to live every day to the fullest, although in practice this doesn't really change much. One of the most character-centric Homer episodes of the show, having him think he's going to die makes him spill out the deepest desires in his heart as he makes a literal list of things that are the most important to him. Despite his many flaws, Homer is still the type of person to care deeply about those around him, with most of the items on his list being about his relationships with others rather than simply naming experiences he's never done before. In Homer's mind, his legacy exists in his children and the people around him, how they perceived him as a person, and his enduring memory in their minds. Thematically, this episode also plays with the idea of mundanity and comfort zones. The entire plot is prompted by a desire to change things up, and the bulk of the main story is about Homer trying to do all of the things he never would have because he assumed there would be more time to do so. It calls into question why he never did those things in the first place, although there is a cut ending to this episode where Homer attends Flanders' barbecue when all of the people he annoyed over the last 22 hours return to give him a piece of their mind. This was ultimately cut for budgetary and time concerns, and so the ending is instead reused footage from Moaning Lisa. The Way We Was. When the television goes out, the Simpson family passes the time together by listening to their parents tell the story of how they met. Back in high school, Marge received attention after reading some feminist literature and starting a protest at the front entrance. There, she met Homer for the first time, as he was in for general Homerness. He tries to get to know Marge better by sharing a common interest, and ends up faking that he needs French lessons, as she's a tutor for that subject. Over the course of the evening, the two fall for each other, and soon Homer asks Marge to the prom, which she agrees to. At least, until Homer reveals the ruse, that he's not in French and merely tricked Marge into spending time with him. Upset that he lied to her, and also made her stay up too late the night before a debate meet, she storms off and eventually goes to the prom with Artie Ziff, a local brainiac, instead. But Artie turns out to be too handsy for Marge's taste, and in the end, she decides to go back with the more genuinely wholesome Homer. The cliché of fat guy hot wife is something that's been a part of the sitcom genre dating back before The Simpsons ever aired. There's this pervasive idea that just because a guy is fat, bald, stupid, and lazy, he won't be prevented from finding love with an ideal housewife as long as he's nice enough to her. Partially, this is a trope due to the fact that the stupid dad archetype of fiction is routinely able to get much more development, as the writers flesh out his character more and more as the show runs, whereas his wife often serves a purely supporting role and doesn't get the same amount of attention. And so we quickly learn not to judge the man of the house, as there's so much more to him than what appears on the surface. But the woman of the house doesn't get that same level of depth, and therefore has to be much more surface-level appealing. I'll say that The Simpsons is guilty of this cliché in its earlier seasons to the same extent as the shows it parodies and borrows from. So many of the episodes so far have focused on Bart or Homer, and we've only seen a sparse amount of attention given to Lisa, with this episode being one of the only Marge-centric episodes of the first 2 seasons. And while part of this can be attributed to the fact that the writers' team is going to be writing what they know, one might expect that they notice this trend and poke fun at it much in the same way as they've done with so many other tropes. It's not a major complaint, and the character dynamics still work fine, and in fact, The Simpsons still manages to stand above its contemporary programming during this time period, but this is an observation I'm making nonetheless. Homer versus Lisa and the Eighth Commandment. Homer gets an illegal cable hookup, allowing the Simpson family to watch dozens of channels for free. They all enjoy the newfound shows to watch until Lisa gets scared over a lesson on the 10 Commandments from church, thinking that if her family continues to steal cable, their souls will be damned to hell. She declares her intention to non-violently protest the offending technology in their household by publicly refusing to view it herself. This guild starts to spread to Marge and Homer just as a grand spectacle fight is announced on cable, Watson vs. Tatum, and Homer has invited everybody he knows. In the end, the guild overstealing is too much for Homer to bear, and he joins Lisa in her protest alongside the rest of the family, cutting the cable as soon as the fight is over. The split in the family during this episode is one down the lines of morality. In order from most to least moral, we have Lisa, Marge, Homer, and then Bart, and I suppose Maggie would be somewhere in the middle, depending on impressionability. Bart is the last to oppose the act of stealing cable, and even makes a scheme to profit off of it, showing other kids the Top Hat channel after being expressly forbidden from watching it by Homer. Homer is slow to come around and is the original reason the family stole cable in the first place, but he's able to eventually be guilted into the right course of action, not only by Lisa's protest, but by seeing the kind of influence he's having on Bart. Marge is quick to feel the same sense of guilt and shame as Lisa, and is even the first to make an active effort to fix her behavior, in the form of 2 measly stinkin' grapes. And this leads us to Lisa's sense of morality. While she knew at first that there was some moral opposition to Homer's act of theft, it still took a bit of prodding before she really began to act on those ideals. Comparing this to later seasons, Lisa is still developing her sense of justice and fairness. It usually takes some outside influence before she decides to start soapboxing at first, but as the series progresses, she becomes much more assertive in declaring what actions she finds reprehensible. To make it more interesting, her typical source of knowledge on the world is her father, Homer, so to see her oppose him as he takes the high ground in so many issues is an interesting implementation of how she's developing despite her family rather than because of them. Principal Charming. Lamenting her life of celibacy after the wedding of a co-worker, Selma requests the help of the Simpson family in finding her a husband, so Homer spends the day searching for a suitable match for her before settling on Principal Skinner. He makes a plan for the two to meet over dinner, but accidentally introduces Patty to the man instead, and it's a quick match, as the two both hate all of the same things. As they grow closer and closer together, Skinner becomes nicer and nicer, eventually overlooking many of Bart's antics as he's too happy to care. And Selma grows more and more resentful of her sister's happiness, becoming less optimistic about her own relationship prospects before eventually setting for Barney. But when Patty realizes that her sister's happiness is her own, she breaks things off with Skinner so the two twins can spend their lives together again. The lovelorn antics of the ancillary cast of The Simpsons is nearly as fleshed out as the romantic lives of Homer and Marge. Often, these are used as a means of telling love stories that don't involve the happily married or otherwise. To tell a story of two adults figuring out whether or not to settle, you need a new set of characters entirely. But The Simpsons writers instead prefer to use existing established cast members for this purpose. And this has the end result of giving a sense of history to the world. When Bart gets in trouble at school, it isn't just a stern principal archetype telling him off, but a stern principal who has suffered a heartbreak and has a strained relationship with his mother. Because The Simpsons uses their established characters for these roles get to be reshaped to the characters rather than the other way around, and as such they come across as that much more relatable, because it's happening to somebody we've grown used to seeing. There's an interesting development in Skinner's personality as a result of his relationship with Patty, in that he becomes a much nicer person to the students, much to the detriment of rule of law at Springfield Elementary. It calls into question whether Skinner was nicer because he was in love, or because he had an outlet for his negative feelings with Patty, who reveled equally in putting others down. Likewise, Patty seems to be multiple times nicer, though it's hard to tell because 0 times anything is still 0, as she opens up to Skinner. But this is The Simpsons, so in the end, Patty returns to her love in Selma, and Skinner returns to his love in Springfield Elementary School. Oh brother, where art thou? After a heart attack scare, Abraham Simpson decides to tell Homer about the fact that he has a younger half-brother, born out of wedlock and sent to an adoption agency before Homer was born. So Homer tracks down his long-lost brother, only to learn that the man, Herbert Powell, is a multimillionaire owner of a car company. The company isn't doing well as it's losing more and more ground to the Japanese due to a lack of appeal to the average American. So when Homer, an average American, comes along, Herbert sees an opportunity to have a car designed by his target audience, and so he gives free rein to the Simpson to design whatever he wants. At first, the engineers ignore his advice and continue on with their design without him. But after Herb gives him a pep talk, Homer reasserts himself and designs the car the way he wants to, which ends up being a monstrosity that not only barely works, but costs $82,000, which is $180,000 in today's money. Due to having invested so much into the design, his company gets bought out by the Japanese, and Herb is sent penniless on a bus into the sunset. While this episode presents Homer as an average American, the truth is that he's really an exaggeration of average American traits, an extreme version of the flaws the writers want to satirize, used as a point from which to make observations. But it tracks that Herb would make the mistake of thinking otherwise, as he's the type of person to have never had any sort of strong relationship to family, or even other people. So missing the point and assuming his brother represents the country ends up being the mistake that brings the downfall of his company, as rather than creating a car for an American, he creates a car for a stereotype of one. Herb is introduced as an anti-Homer. He's assertive and strong-willed, as well as willing to get in people's faces when he needs them to do something. Compared to the more spineless and depressive Homer, Herb is also a much more ambitious man, always trying to figure out something that nobody else can see, and having worked his way up from nothing to the top. Homer's life started out as average and is, for its time, still the average that you would expect out of television. And so the major difference between the two is a function not only of intelligence, but assertiveness. That Homer is less willing to push people around to get his way is perhaps why he's gotten along better than his brother in regards to his social connections and his family. Bart's dog gets an F. When Lisa is home sick with the mumps, Marge decides it's a good time to introduce her to her birthright, an heirloom quilt passed down the generations. Homer gets a new pair of shoes out of jealousy of the Flanderses, and Santa's little helper destroys them both, which forces the Simpson family to decide that perhaps he should be given away unless he's able to learn something in obedience school. But as Bart refuses to hurt Santa's little helper as discipline, the dog doesn't learn anything, and after a few more incidents it's decided that he will have to be rehomed. Bart spends one last evening playing with the dog, only for Santa's little helper to finally respond to kindness, and so the family doesn't give him away in the end. The Simpson family pets have always existed as background elements, no more characters than the house or the furniture. And so we now get an episode around developing Santa's little helper, not only as a character, but as a Simpson. He's the incarnation of everything we notice about our neighbors' dogs. Namely, we only really notice when their pets are misbehaving or otherwise inconveniencing us. When a pet behaves itself, it gets a few scritches before being forgotten about, much as Snowball 2 and Santa's Little Helper routinely are in episodes where the plot doesn't require them. One other thing brought up in this episode is Marge's affinity for quilting, with the memorable gag of her abusing her finger to show off the talent. But this is the first we ever really get to see of it, as well as the heirloom quilt which has now only come into existence. It's not as though introducing one-off concepts in this way is an inherently bad thing. The Simpsons does this all the time, but the more concerning aspect of this introduction is that we're learning so much about Marge, who has yet to get an episode focusing on her, during an episode about the family dog. Santa's Little Helper got a spotlight episode before Marge did. Old money. Abraham Simpson meets and falls in love with Beatrice B. Simmons, and the two begin to spend more and more time together. But when Homer drags his father away from the retirement home on Bee's birthday, she passes away and Abe is left to mourn her loss. He's given $106,000 as an inheritance and decides to spend it on himself, rather than on the son who took him from the last moment in his beloved's life. But this doesn't bring him any happiness until the ghost of Bee visits him and tells him to share the wealth, making others as happy as he made her. So he hears petitioners from Springfield who all ask for a share of the cash, until eventually Lisa convinces him to give it to a charitable cause. But realizing that the amount of money he got is not nearly enough to help everybody who needs it, Abe Simpson takes it gambling, and thanks to Homer stopping him from making a few unwise bets, walks away with enough to renovate the Springfield retirement castle, giving a sense of dignity to all of the residents. This is one of the first episodes of the show to follow the loose style that the later seasons would solidify into a staple of the series, where A plots and B plots are distanced by time rather than cuts between scenes, and the first act may tell a completely different story than the second or third. In this way, many Simpsons episodes feel like several shorts connected by plot threads, rather than one continuous story as one may see in other contemporary shows. As such, when an episode begins, there's no way to tell how it will end or what elements of the story are going to continue being relevant by the story's conclusion, much like in real life. Old Money is an episode that deals with the theme that gets brought up in The Simpsons on occasion, and that is the way that the elderly are treated by society. In a world where so many people define themselves by their role in a household or their career, what happens to an empty nester who's also retired? If, from a cultural standpoint, they no longer contribute to the larger capitalist systems in the country, then do they even exist? Often, the elderly are forgotten about or left to fend for themselves, with their needs being statistically too small to be worth consideration. After all, what kind of strategy is it to divert resources towards people who won't be around much longer anyway? And of course, as we turn our backs on the elderly, they'll end up turning their backs on us too. This is a lesson that both Homer and Abe learn, as it's Homer's wisdom to stop gambling that Abe was unwilling to listen to, because he internalized that message. In the end, the amount of dignity one deserves has nothing to do with their age, and everybody is better off for having learned that. Brush with greatness. Homer gets stuck in a water slide due to his weight and vows to start dieting and exercising seriously. While searching for his weights, he comes across an old painting of Ringo Starr that Marge made in high school, and she recounts the story of how she lost the love of painting due to an uncaring art teacher. But Lisa encourages Marge to apply to a community college art class, and while there, a painting she made of Homer asleep on the couch wins an award. This catches the attention of Mr. Burns, who needs a portrait of himself to be unveiled in a new wing of the art museum he's funding, and he hires her for her ability to find inner beauty in her subjects. But Mr. Burns' nasty attitude as he poses for her makes it difficult for Marge to find any sort of beauty in the man, and she eventually loses the drive to paint once again. But when an extremely belated reply from Ringo Starr reaches Marge where he praises her artistic abilities, she is reinvigorated, and eventually paints a portrait of Burns in the nude. She justifies her decision by saying that it was done to show how, despite his horrible personality, he's still a frail old man, and is as human as any of us. An interesting parallel is drawn between Marge and Lisa in this episode, in that Lisa's affinity for music was crushed by a close-minded teacher before being reinvigorated by Bleeding Gums Murphy, just as Marge's old affinity for painting was due to another unsupportive adult. But ultimately, Marge's return to her passion is something a bit more optimistic, in that she eventually finds a support network from her family, and later her idol, whereas Lisa needs to look outside her household to find somebody able and willing to inspire her. But this episode does take the connection between the two and build on what we saw from them back in Moaning Lisa. Marge's adolescence was a time where she never received the support that she wanted from those around her, and seeing Lisa get the same upbringing she recognizes as bad for her stands up for her daughter in a way that now makes much more sense to us as viewers. This is the first real Marge episode we've gotten in the show so far, at least an episode that doesn't focus on Marge in terms of her relationship to another character. It does a great job of showing her sense of conviction, not just in standing up to somebody who wrongs her, but in tolerating them up to that point. It's because of her more immediately forgiving nature that she's able to get away with her outburst without ever seeming as though she's being off-putting or overstepping any sort of boundary. It's an implementation of the concept of turn the other cheek. If she's wronged, Marge is quick to forgive, but only once and only if she's the offended party. Lisa's substitute. Miss Hoover, Lisa's second-grade teacher, is on an extended leave of absence, and so a substitute teacher, Mr. Bergstrom, takes over. He proves to be everything Lisa has ever wanted out of the public school system, willing to engage with every student, resistant to the vices that ruin so many other Springfieldianites, and not afraid of his own emotions. But when Miss Hoover returns and Mr. Bergstrom leaves to go to another school, Lisa wonders if there will ever be another person who understands her on the same level, as she's convinced her father will never live up to that same reputation. But after she loses her temper at Homer's lack of ambition, Homer eventually acknowledges that he won't be able to become the person Lisa wants him to be, but he's still going to try his best. Meanwhile, Bart runs for student body president against Martin, and his campaign starts off promising, due to his charismatic lead over the other boy. But his message of voting is lame works too well, and he eventually loses the election, although Homer in the end convinces Bart that a bunch of responsibilities with none of the prestige to go with them isn't really worth lamenting the loss of. With all of the mental and emotional failings of Homer, it's a safe assumption that Lisa is growing up without a positive male role model, and so she latches on to the first gentle man she meets in Springfield. And so having met an adult that exemplifies everything she wants to be, Lisa gets a new reason to live, as she's now convinced that there is, in fact, a place in the world, in the future, for people like her. Because one of Lisa's greatest fears is the idea that she might grow up to be like everybody else. Her intelligence is never properly challenged by those around her, and she's constantly faced with a lack of stimulation, making her depressed and angsty, as though her gifts are not an asset to an increasingly dumbed-down world. And of course, this is the message the episode ends up sending. Homer is meant to be a representation of middle-class American men, his role within The Simpsons mirroring the socially perceived role of the modern American father. Because it's believed that being able to communicate in a healthy way with your daughter isn't very masculine, so Homer can't get along well with Lisa without compromising some part of his identity. Mr. Bergstrom represents a rejection of those standards, unbothered by the ridicule of society in favor of living the way he wants to, and as such, he's able to have a much healthier relationship with Lisa than Homer ever could. But in the end, Homer does manage to grow beyond his old self, not just a representation of Homer's desire to improve, but society's slow rejection of typical masculine ideals. The War of the Simpsons. The Simpson family throws a house party where Homer gets extremely drunk and makes a fool of himself by acting profane. So Marge decides to sign the two of them up for a couples retreat in order to repair their marriage, something Homer objects to until he realizes it will be held at a common fishing spot. Rather than putting forth a good faith effort to engage with Reverend Lovejoy's counseling, Homer sneaks off in the morning to go fishing, hoping to catch General Sherman, a nickname given to a giant catfish that lives near the retreat site. He succeeds in catching the giant fish, but when Marge confronts him about abandoning her for recreation, he declares that the marriage is more important to him than a fish and lets General Sherman, as well as his shot at fame and a legacy, go free. Meanwhile, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie are being taken care of by Grandpa Simpson, though they take advantage of his feebleness to do whatever they want to and throw a party. In the end, they see him crying over his failure to maintain control and feel guilty enough to clean up the house, only for Abe to reveal that he was fake crying in order to guilt-trip them into behaving. The idea of a grand romantic gesture is one that has been a staple of romantic comedies and sitcoms for as long as those genres have existed. The means of showing one big deed that can undo years of neglect in a relationship in order to prove to the audience that the couple belongs together. But while this is a standard in television, it's far from a proper way to handle a real relationship. Media in the following decades would take a much closer look at this sort of trope, but I don't think that any show has ever told it better than BoJack Horseman's episode, Free Churro. Years of pop cultural inundation have given us a skewed vision of what a healthy relationship is supposed to look like, when the truth has always been very boring. A good romance is one where you can do absolutely nothing with someone else and still find the time fulfilling. But a couple lying in bed together showing each other random memes they saw on their phone doesn't make for very compelling television. In fact, this might play into why these relationships are presented in the way that they are in the first place. A relationship that's held together by sporadic grand moments will never be one that's truly healthy, and so the need for more and more grand moments will arise to continue the cycle. The underlying problem can't get fixed because there wouldn't be any more show if it was. Three Men and a Comic Book. At a comic convention, Bart finds a seller with a copy of Radioactive Man #1, and so he makes it his new goal in life to possess that comic book. But despite all the various odd jobs he works over the next few days, he isn't anywhere close to being able to afford it. Until Martin and Milhouse end up in the store at the same time, and Bart agrees to split the cost of the book between the trio. They manage to buy the book and read it in Bart's treehouse, but when it's time to go their separate ways, nobody can decide who gets the privilege of taking the book home with them. In the end, the boys spend the night in the treehouse growing increasingly paranoid with each other as they assume that the other two are trying to steal their prize. It isn't until a scuffle turns violent that Bart has to decide between saving Milhouse from a fall or saving the book from being blown away, and he chooses the former. In the end, the book is destroyed and the three lament at having lost everything because they couldn't share. One thing this episode does well, emblematic of The Simpsons as a whole, is the way it teaches false morals, or to clarify, how the lessons taught in this episode subvert the typical implementation of lessons learned from media in general. Bart is supposed to learn the value of hard work after a series of degrading jobs that lead to him finally being able to afford the comic book he wants. But instead, he works hard, suffers through it, and winds up hardly any better off than he was at the start. After the comic book is destroyed, the three boys lament its destruction, and that they could have had partial ownership if they had only trusted each other enough to share. But they come to this conclusion without some sort of hugging it out, instead being more annoyed that the universe doled out karmic justice than anything. This episode also leads into the nerdier side of culture, the communal capitalist childhood so many of the era shared growing up. All reading the same comic books, watching the same cartoons, and living similar enough lives that nostalgia became a massive marketable force. But far from exclusively praising this sort of geekdom, it instead derides it as something that should be limited to the imaginations of children and the occasional excursion. We're meant to put ourselves in Bart's shoes as an excited child, eager to learn the origins of his favorite superhero, but get too into the culture surrounding it, and you become the aptly named comic book guy, an obese neckbeard whose only close company is that of children. Blood Feud. Mr. Burns collapses from hypohemia and needs a blood transfusion to survive, but since he has O negative blood, a very rare blood type, the only one able to help him is Bart Simpson. Sensing the potential for a grand reward, Homer encourages Bart to donate to his boss, and soon Mr. Burns makes a full recovery. He writes a card for the Simpson family, and moves on with his life to write a memoir of his struggle and recovery. But Homer is annoyed at the lack of a tangible reward, and so he and Bart write a strongly worded letter insulting the old man. Marge convinces Homer not to stoop to the level of sending it, but Bart delivers the letter anyway, and when Mr. Burns reads it and sees how Homer really feels about him, decides to have him fired and beaten to a pulp. But Mr. Smithers is able to make Mr. Burns see the error in his ways, and he changes his mind, buying the Simpson family a giant Olmec head. The final lines of this episode and the final exchange of the season is perhaps the best summary of the approach to writing it that the Simpsons staff has. No lessons, no morals, no feel-good endings, it's just a bunch of stuff that happened. A show about nothing was a refreshing change of pace in a media landscape inundated with sappy stories about togetherness that ultimately no real family would ever be able to relate to. And while The Simpsons is far from the first show to reject typical Hays Code cliches, it was the first to strike the precise chord needed to garner the attention of America by featuring characters that just about anybody alive could relate to. Blood Feud is ultimately a tale about the completely different lives led by the two halves of Springfield. Burns is rich enough that money is hardly a thought in his head when it comes to a reward, but for the Simpson family, it's enough to motivate practically every action in this episode. Homer and Bart's letter to Mr. Burns is driven by anger directed towards their lack of a proper reward for what they perceive as a deed well done, even if the motivation for that deed wasn't as pure as they have pretended it was. And yet it isn't as though that rage ended up being a completely destructive force. If they hadn't tried for revenge against Mr. Burns for the perceived slight, then they would have gotten nothing. But because they did, there was a reward after all, just one that's so functionally useless and encumbering that they may as well have gotten nothing. And so there really is no moral to this episode, just a bunch of mishaps that occur to people desperately trying to seek meaning in a world that doesn't care about what they feel they deserve. Season 3. Within only 2 seasons, The Simpsons was able to become a total cultural icon, the family becoming one of the most well-known, not only on television, but in stores and advertising. While the first season was an overnight success, the second is what catapulted the show into the minds not only of TV watchers, but the rest of the world as well. It grew to the point that other brands were beginning to attach themselves to the fictional family to promote themselves, rather than the other way around. Season 3 began a trend where celebrity guest stars appeared on the show not merely as a bit appearance, but as themselves and playing a role in the plot. And while this is a trend that would later be derided as indicative of the show's decline in quality, for now, it wasn't played out so much that audiences saw it as a gimmick. Season 3 also saw a shift in staff. The duo of Al Jean and Mike Rice were brought on as showrunners, replacing the existing trio of Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Sam Simon. These members would still have a role on the show, but they took a backseat to allow others the spotlight. These new showrunners were already veterans of the show, having contributed to many of the more emotional episodes, although to say that an individual wrote an episode of The Simpsons is a bit of a misnomer. The writer credited with the episode is typically just the person to have thought up the episode's plot and created a rough draft, while the actual episode is written in a more collaborative method involving all the writing staff. The third season ultimately marked a shift in the way that The Simpsons told its stories, the down-to-earth realism being done away with for larger plot beats with more grandeur. Rather than the Simpson family dealing with a problem many people in the audience may relate to or have experienced themselves, Season 3 and on would show a more deranged side to Springfield. Plots were exciting and involved more locations and more people, even the occasional celebrity. But the core of the show, the emotion behind the family, was something that remained unchanged no matter what the universe felt like throwing at The Simpsons. Stark Raving Dad. After Bart puts his red hat in with Homer's white clothing, the clothes are dyed pink and he stands out at work, which prompts the power plant to perform a psychological evaluation that winds up with Homer in a mental institution. While there, he meets a man who introduces himself as Michael Jackson, despite being a large, overweight white guy. After Marge is able to get her husband out of the institution, Homer invites his former roommate to his house for a few days as a thanks for helping him to get through the rough experience. But Bart, excited at meeting Michael Jackson, tells Milhouse, and soon the whole city waits to meet the musical legend, only to be let down when they find out it's not the real Jackson. In the end, real or not, Michael helps Bart to write a song for Lisa to celebrate her birthday, and all is well, at least within the Simpson family. Michael reveals that he's really an impersonator named Leon, who realized that impersonating Jackson made him easier to like, and he leaves with his work done. It's going to be impossible to discuss this episode without also bringing up the later controversy surrounding it, as well as the decision to pull it from later edition DVD releases and streaming platforms. As I've mentioned before, The Simpsons is a show that serves well as a time capsule, a representation of the cultural landscape of its time. I don't think that at the time there was an ill intention with this episode, even if the context of Bart and Jackson staying up all night together becomes muddied with new information being made available. Michael Jackson has been dead for over a decade. Continuing to air the episode arguably cannot cause any harm, but on the other hand, may also be considered disrespectful to victims, not only of his own abuse, but of anybody else who's been manipulated by the wealthy and powerful. In the end, while I don't think the decision to make the episode totally verboten is the right one, I don't think that there is a correct option. And so erring on the side of caution is the better choice than any alternative. But for the time it was released, Stark Raving Dad managed to be a perfectly serviceable episode, one that shows off a combination of the many strengths of The Simpsons. The plot is split into two, one following the brother-sister conflict between Bart and Lisa, while the other side of the plot makes some poignant social commentary of what we consider to be outsider behavior. Homer is considered some sort of deviant for wearing a pink shirt, and Leon is considered insane for impersonating a celebrity, no matter how many people's days are brightened by his impressions. The way Jackson was incorporated into the episode was well navigated. While he himself is a big draw to the episode's appeal, the main story is fundamentally about the emotional relationships of the Simpson family, combined with just enough social commentary to keep it relevant. It's a strong start to a strong season. Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington. Due to Homer's newfound love of reading, Lisa gets the idea to enter an essay contest where the winner gets an all-expenses-paid trip to Washington, D.C., America's capital.
She writes a patriotic essay inspired by the natural beauty of the country and wins the first round of the contest, advancing to the next phase and allowing the Simpson family to travel with her. They get up to their typical antics until Lisa encounters a dirty deal being done at one of the lesser trafficked monuments that shakes her faith in democracy. So she rewrites her essay to be less crowd-pleasing and more cynical of the entire system, calling out the corruption that she saw and decrying the systems that would allow that sort of finance. Her essay shocks the audience, but also motivates a Senate page to report the incident, and within just a few hours, the congressman in question is arrested, proving that the system works. Lisa has always served as a sort of creator soapbox, the character who is a stand-in for what sort of messages the writers want in plain text. Her personality has always leaned towards questioning authority and coming up with a system of morality that's distinct from what polite society tolerates, and Season 3 is when that sense of self becomes activism. Rather than staying a simple observer to the world, reacting to what other characters do, say, and think, Lisa has become the type to go out of her way to denounce or praise certain behaviors, and then to act on her own words. But this isn't just a change in the way Lisa is behaving, rather, it's a change in the way the Simpsons have engaged with the world. In the first 2 seasons, the Simpson family felt small. They were merely a part of a much larger world, and whenever something happened, they would be in the center of the conflict. Now, they tend to be more assertive, with episode plots happening less in spite of the Simpsons, and more so because of them. Before, things happened at them. Now, things happen to them. And so, the change in Lisa's personality is merely a logical response to a subtle shift in the writing style that gives more agency to the characters. Their wants and desires start to play a much larger role in grander plots, and as such, the characters have to come across as much stronger so those plots can be initiated realistically in the first place. When Flanders failed. Ned Flanders quits his job in order to start the Leftorium, a store that specializes in left-handed tools and appliances. Still in his perpetual state of envy, Homer wishes for his neighbor's downfall, that Ned will go bankrupt as his store goes under. As the days go on, nobody actually shops at Ned's store, and he's forced to take more and more desperate measures to stay afloat, before finally Homer feels guilty enough to take matters into his own hands. He calls up every left-handed person he knows, and in a massive word-of-mouth campaign, attracts the attention to the store that in the end causes the Leftorium to become a success. In the B-plot, Bart lies about going to a karate class and pretends to have learned the Touch of Death, which he uses to bully Lisa. But when she's being harassed by the schoolyard bullies, Lisa tries to get Bart to defend her, only for him to receive comeuppance instead. The actual pace of this episode is remarkably slow. Ned's failure takes up several redundant scenes to show off his business hemorrhaging money, and Homer slowly transitioning from gloating in Ned's misery to lamenting for his neighbor's loss. And the B-plot of the episode involving Bart's fib only gets started up in the second act, concluding rather abruptly in the third. But far from this detracting from the episode's overall quality, it is instead a means to allow more of the episode's focus to be on character interactions and humor. The multiple scenes of Ned selling off more and more allow the episode to spread out the build-up to the finale, Homer steadily meeting people who have a demand for something left-handed that's not currently being met. This also means more opportunities to contrast the behavior of Homer and his now enemy, Ned. And this one-sided animosity is actually something that's pretty new. While Homer has never been a big fan of Ned's, the outright hatred is something that we've only seen once before in Dead Pudding Society. But that was a mutual argument between the two that, while still started by Homer, was also a two-person ordeal. Here, Homer still seems to have that previous level of hatred, only without the build-up to why their relationship has reached that point. It might be the earliest glimpse at Flanderization of characters in The Simpsons, and ironically, it's in an episode where Flanders' faith is barely even brought up. Ultimately, this episode has a few faults, but none that distract majorly from the overall appeal of the episode, and in fact, many of them only add to the best parts of it by pulling other distracting elements away. Bart the Murderer. After a particularly bad day at school, Bart finds himself inside of a local mafia hangout. But rather than having him shot, he instead impresses them with a few accurate horse race guesses and his ability to mix a decent Manhattan. They give him a part-time job, doing odd work and paying extremely well, enough that they're able to assuage the family's concerns over the character of his associates. But after Bart winds up late due to Principal Skinner keeping him after school, they ask to speak with the man, only for Skinner to go missing the next day. Bart becomes consumed with guilt over the thought that he may have had his principal killed, made worse when his associates are arrested, and they all conspire to pin the blame for their racketeering on him. But before he can be sentenced, Skinner himself arrives and reveals the truth, that he was never killed, merely trapped beneath a stack of newspapers for the last week. In the end, Bart is let off the hook, and he renounces the life of a mobster. Within 2 seasons, we've seen Bart's antics progress from beheading a statue to jumping a gorge to being tried for murder. As The Simpsons has reached out to further and further places, the scale of what the characters could and did do also expanded. The show is able to stay fresh by one-upping its previous iterations, but never manages to lose the audience due to the show holding fast enough to restraint that the plot never becomes grand for the sake of grandeur. Bart is tried for murder, but this is still an episode about a boy getting in over his head. Like the Telltale Head, we ultimately have an episode about a boy's attention-seeking behavior as he searches for some sort of place where he can fit in. And so scaling from a delinquent to a daredevil to a death row inmate comes across less like the writers trying to one-up themselves, and more as a logical scaling of what Bart would search for next. Another revisited theme this episode deals with is the media frenzy surrounding a specific character. It's reminiscent of the episode Krusty Gets Busted, as we see the news fall for its own exaggerations as they play into the media's cycle of fear in order to oversell a story. But rather than the victim of the news smelling blood in the water being a fictional celebrity, it is instead focused on a Simpson themselves. This means that we're able to take a much more nuanced look at the effect this sort of infamy can have on the person at the center of it all, rather than the outsider's perspective that we received earlier. And of course, Bart is the character who has danced closest to this sort of delinquent lifestyle, and as such, his view on this world is the scariest, as this is the most likely future for him. Homer defined. The nuclear power plant undergoes a potential core meltdown only to be saved at the last minute by Homer's blind guessing at what his actual job is supposed to be. For averting the disaster, he's lauded as a hero by the whole city, but none of the praise rings true as he knows it's all based on a lie. This culminates in Homer being sent to the Shelbyville plant to give a speech on keeping calm under pressure, but when the other plant also undergoes a meltdown, Homer once again saves the day by blindly guessing at what he's supposed to do. His secret revealed, the respect he once received is gone, and the world begins to laugh at him instead of worship him. In the B-plot, Milhouse doesn't invite Bart to his birthday party as his mother, Luann, doesn't want the two boys to be friends, as Bart is a bad influence. But Marge speaks with the boy's mother and convinces her that it's better for both of them, as they don't have anybody else. Homer in this episode is defined by his dumb luck. Homer in the series proper is defined by his dumb luck. He's consistently shown to be a man of below average intelligence and rarely goes out of his way to improve himself or work at something until his back is against the wall. Despite this, he has an easy and a high-paying job, a loving-ish family, and enough leisure time to pursue a frankly absurd number of other hobbies. So for him to prevent a nuclear meltdown with the same dumb luck completely reads for his character. This dumb luck is something that's come about as a necessary aspect of his character, however. Throughout the whole show, Homer routinely gets into a lot of trouble and needs to go above and beyond to get out of said trouble. But how can he get out of these messes so consistently without also making himself unrelatable to audiences? And so he needs to have that level of luck to make him into a character that interesting things can happen to without also coming across as superhuman. This episode's B-plot plays into the fears and anxieties of many mothers across America. Just as Luann worries about Bart's influence on her son, so many authority figures wondered the same thing about their children. Could watching Bart's antics set a bad example for their own children? After all, in the previous episode he wound up on trial for murder. Maybe he's not the ideal role model for America's youth. But on the other hand, if a child is so enamored by Bart Simpson, it's likely that they're spending a lot of time around the television instead of their other friends and family members. So in the end, why try to limit your child's exposure to the world of The Simpsons when it's clear that that's all that they have?
Like father, like clown. Krusty the Clown has dinner with the Simpson family, and after saying grace, reveals that he's not only Jewish, but estranged from his hardcore religious father.
He tells him about how the appeal of clowning kept drawing him in, despite his father's disapproval, and when the ruse was finally revealed, he was kicked out of the house, never to see his dad again. Recalling these memories starts to make him depressed, to the point where he can't even laugh on his show, and eventually Bart and Lisa decide to mobilize in order to reunite the family. But Rabbi Highman Krustovsky is sharp, and all of their attempts to quote scripture at him fail to convince him to reunite. That is, until they find a quote from Sammy Davis Jr., a Jewish entertainer, that convinces the rabbi that perhaps he's been too quick to judge. In the end, Krusty reunites with his father during a live show, and they sing the crowd into the credits. The concept for this episode comes from the 1927 film The Jazz Singer, where a son decides to become a musician instead of a rabbi, and his father threatens to disown him, prompting the son to perform in blackface in order to hide his identity. In this episode, it's clownface instead, but the emotional point of the episode remains the same. A son must choose between family and career. Although in the original movie this plot comes to a head when the rabbi becomes ill and the jazz singer must decide whether to perform an opening night or reconcile with his father. Of course, this sort of plot is not the kind of thing that has a large role for the Simpson family to perform, and so minor changes needed to occur in order to not only allow for a potential guest star to return, but for audiences to recognize their favorite characters. While the line is told as a joke, Lisa's quote, "A man who envies our family is a man who needs help," is actually rather ironic considering the ironic realism that would later be brought to the show in episodes like Homer's Enemy. Because while the Simpson family is made up of a series of exaggerations of the worst traits of modern families, in order for all of these traits to be present in the first place, there has to be at least some sort of connection between the cast. They might not get along, but at least they're together enough that they can fight in the first place. And so anybody who lacks the family ties that the Simpsons have would surely be jealous, even of a dysfunctional family. Treehouse of Horror II. A second Treehouse of Horror segment, this one with the same concept as the first, only with the framing device changed to the Simpson family having individual nightmares after eating too much Halloween candy. The first segment is based on the W.W. Jacobs story, The Monkey's Paw. Homer buys a monkey's paw that grants wishes, but with ironic twists. The first real wish is that the Simpson family becomes rich and famous, their fame becoming bloated, and America resenting the needless advertising they're attached to. Lisa then wishes for world peace, but Kang and Kodos discover that the Earth is now vulnerable to invasion, and they conquer the planet with crude weaponry. Finally, Homer gets a turkey sandwich, and it's a little dry. Frustrated with the failures, and humanity being enslaved by aliens, Homer gives the paw to Ned, who immediately undoes the invasion by inventing the board with the nail through it, and then sprucing up his house. The second segment is a retelling of the Twilight Zone tale, It's a Good Life, where a spoiled 10-year-old played by Bart has the power to read people's minds and punish them for thinking unhappy thoughts. But rather than the typical ending, we instead have a Jack-in-the-Box Homer reconcile with his son, and the two rediscover their familial love with one another, which leads to Bart waking up in his bed horrified. In the final story, Homer dreams that his brain is removed by Mr. Burns and placed into the body of a worker robot, but the robot inherits his work ethic and refuses to do anything, so Burns and Smithers undo the experiment, only for the robot to crush Burns and force some emergency surgery. In the end, his head is grafted onto Homer's body, and the episode ends ambiguous as to whether it was a nightmare or reality. Lisa's Pony. After Homer neglects to get Lisa a new reed for her saxophone the night of a recital to go drinking at Moe's instead, she refuses to forgive him. Homer goes through old baby videos of Lisa's various childhood firsts, only to realize that he's never paid any attention to her, and concludes that she can't love him because he's never been there to be loved. And so he formulates a plan to win back Lisa's affection, buying her the pony she's always been asking for. But ponies aren't cheap, and soon, Homer is forced to work a second job to afford the new pet, working at the Quickie Mart from midnight to 8 a.m. The new work schedule leaves him no time to spend with his daughter, and slowly erodes his physical and mental health, until eventually he can't keep the jobs a secret from his kids any longer. In the end, Lisa decides to give up the pony because the only big animal she can love is her dad. Homer has never been a good parent to Lisa. While his job is able to keep a roof over her head and food on her plate, this is only what's required as a father. To be a dad requires the ability to be a proper role model as well as a provider, and this is where Homer fails. And so the logical conclusion as to how he can be both is by playing up one end of the deal. He may not be able to spend time with her properly, but he can double down on his work, exhausting himself as a replacement for human affection, as that's the style of caretaking that he knows. But of course, replacing one kind of love with another won't fix the original issue, and at best, Lisa's desire for a positive male role model will only be transferred to a love of her pony, Princess. In the end, this episode's messaging is a little bit muddied. Homer tries to win back Lisa's affection with a grand gesture of apology, but that doesn't work. It gives an implication that she's tired of being let down in 100 little ways, only for some big deal to be made out of how much he really loves his daughter, as though it undoes everything else. But then Homer makes another grand gesture in the end, and everything is back to normal. I suppose there is some sense made in how long it takes Lisa to even notice that Homer has been exhausting himself working to afford her pony. After all, he was never there for her before, so why should she notice that he's staying out all night after the fact? There could have been an alternate version of this episode where Lisa learns about Homer's second job earlier, only to decide not to forgive him at first, as she resents the fact that he would rather spend 8 hours a night working than a few hours a week trying to get to know her. Saturdays of Thunder. Homer takes a fatherhood aptitude test at the insistence of Patty and Selma, only to get the lowest score possible. So he decides to help Bart create a soapbox derby racer, and they enter their work into a local race. Their vehicle doesn't even finish, but the winner, Martin, crashes and fractures his arm, leaving him unable to race in the next round. But out of a mutual desire not to see Nelson win, Bart agrees to race in Martin's car rather than the one he and Homer worked on together. Heartbroken by this, Homer mopes around at his house while Bart prepares for the big race. But on the day of the race, he retakes the aptitude test and manages a perfect score, his time with the boy being enough to put him above the threshold. Realizing that he should support his son no matter what, Homer cheers Bart on at the race, and the two manage to win. Homer and Bart are very similar characters, with Bart taking after Homer whether he wants to or not. The issue is with the amount of respect the boy has for his father. Homer is incompetent in many ways, and lazy in others, no matter how much his heart is in the right place. Bart resents his similarities to his father, and tries to act in his own way, and often makes attempts to antagonize the man in order to prove something about his own independence. But ultimately, the two get along well when they're forced to, something that Bart shows conflicted feelings on throughout the show, as well as during this episode. And so most of the time it comes down to an aspect of convenience. When Bart thinks his best chance at winning lies with ignoring his father's help, he ignores it, but when he does win with Homer's emotional support, the two still celebrate together. Ultimately, this episode is one of the weaker Season 3 episodes as its plotline plays out in a very conventional way. The good guy wins in the end after sharing an emotional moment with the family member. The primary reason this episode doesn't read like a typical Simpsons episode is because it really isn't, taking much of its plots from movies such as Days of Thunder and The Natural. And while there's still some sort of that Simpsons charm that makes it stand out from the works it parodies, there isn't quite enough to carry the episode beyond anything other than homage. Flaming Moe's. Hoping to get out of the house during Lisa's sleepover, Homer goes to Moe's Tavern. Since the tavern is out of beer, he instead tries out a recipe Homer came up with called a Flaming Homer. But the drink proves popular, and Moe decides to rebrand it as a Flaming Moe, stealing the glory from his friend. As time goes on, the drink, as well as Moe's Tavern, becomes more and more popular, with Moe able to expand his staff and attract the attention of celebrities and the upper crust of Springfield. But after turning down multiple offers to sell the drink for millions, Moe eventually feels enough guilt to cave in and split the profits with his old friend. But this comes at around the same time that Homer goes crazy out of spite and reveals the recipe to the entire crowd, making the offer to sell worthless. In the end, the whole town is overrun with imitators, and Homer and Moe make up, sharing one more Flaming Homer together. It's not uncommon to see a trope in media where a character receives a sudden windfall and becomes a worse person as a result. Even earlier episodes of The Simpsons have touched on this sort of plotline. But here we see an interesting inversion of that trope. Moe steals the drink from Homer at the very beginning of the episode, before he gets rich off the idea. As the episode goes on and he becomes richer, he maintains the same general personality he's always had. While it's true his success is based on a lie at Homer's expense, this isn't a new trait. He was scummy from the start. Instead, it's Homer who becomes jaded and angry as a result of Moe's wealth and fortune, jealous of the fact that his former friend is profiting off of his idea. So money still corrupts in this plotline, just not in the typical way, though this is sort of a Simpsons staple by this point. A major complaint of the later seasons of The Simpsons is the fact that the celebrity cameos were too self-indulgent and distracted from the episode itself, and I think that contrasting later seasons with this episode is a great point from which to start examining the change. There's a deluge of pop culture references in this episode, from the Cheers parody to an outright appearance by Aerosmith. But these are far from the central focus of the episode, and without the pop culture, the story wouldn't only work, but could also work unchanged from its current iteration. The celebrity appearances are purely fluff, never the point of the episode, despite what the advertising might say. Burns Verkaufen der Kraftwerk, or Burns sells the plant. Feeling as though the plant is holding him back from living a fuller life, Burns decides to sell the Springfield nuclear power plant. Around the same time, Homer sells his stock in the plant for $25, right before the announcement is made. When a group of German investors declare their intention to buy, the value of the stock skyrockets, leaving Homer as the only power plant employee not to receive a large bonus. Burns sells, and the plant falls into new hands, who try to run the place more efficiently and fire Homer as he doesn't really do anything. But Burns fails to find any happiness in the life of a retiree, and after a run-in with Homer at Moe's where the ex-employee tells off his former boss, Burns realizes that the residents of Springfield no longer fear him. And there's no point in being rich if you can't terrorize others with it. Coupled with the Germans struggling to fix all of the flagrant safety issues while staying profitable, Burns buys back the plant, giving Homer his job back if only so he can one day get revenge. There's an interesting take on continuity and wealth in this episode. While many episodes in the past have centered around the Simpson family and money, they ultimately never go anywhere, as should the family receive a large windfall, there would have to be some moment that addresses it being lost. Otherwise, there would be some confusion as to whether the episode was non-canon or where the money went. And while later seasons would ultimately eschew the premise of continuity altogether, by this point there was still a small emphasis on keeping things regular. So the Simpson family can't receive a large amount of money, but side characters can get a few thousand, and ultimately, Mr. Burns is able to receive several $1 million with no real change to anybody, not even the town of Springfield. Which all adds a sense of irony to the entire plot. During the 80s and 90s, there was a fear across the US of foreign investors buying out domestic businesses and improving things by firing much of the staff in pursuit of optimization. That their desire to increase profitability could hurt blue-collar workers. But throughout The Simpsons, we're regularly shown that the biggest threat to the people of Springfield's livelihoods comes from within. This episode was originally meant to have a group of Japanese investors buy out the plant, but the showrunners thought that that might be too predictable, and potentially in bad taste should there be a major buyout in the near future or recent past. I Married Marge. Marge goes to the doctor due to a pregnancy scare, and while she's out, Homer regales his children, at least the ones whose attention he can hold, with the story of how Marge's first pregnancy scare caused their marriage. Homer was working at a mini golf course, which didn't pay well, but was enough to stay afloat. But since his pay couldn't support a family, he went out to search for a new job at the nuclear plant. But without the skills to work there, he's rejected, and soon all of the things they bought for Bart are repossessed as the family falls further and further into debt. Not wanting to let Marge down anymore, Homer vows not to return until he's employed enough to pay for all of them. But Marge refuses to let Homer go at it alone, and after a brief separation, they reunite and pronounce their love for each other once again. Newly invigorated by the support of his wife, Homer marches into Burns' office and demands a job, claiming that he'll be the greatest suck-up he possibly can, and his vigor impresses Burns enough to give him the career he has now. So much of Homer's life is reactive. He's the type of person who rarely changes anything about himself until he's forced to by circumstances outside his control. The greatest ambition he has is sleeping in on the weekends and getting seconds of dessert. And this is a necessary part of his character, as any more would make him unrelatable to the average viewer. As Homer is an amalgamation of American wants and desires, he can only want things that America as a whole wants. So temporary happiness, consumption, and being better than your neighbors. As such, Homer never goes out of his way to try to get something that the audience themselves wouldn't also want, and as such, his life is a series of reactions to various aspects of our world and our cultural problems. And yet it's not as though Homer is an entirely uninteresting person with only selfish motivations. Consistent to his character is the fact that he loves his family and he loves Marge. Many of his greatest moments are things he does in order to maintain his relationships, or at the very least, the status quo. As such, The Simpsons is a show that's able to expand upon the typical lack of continuity in modern sitcoms by enforcing it through its character motivations. Homer wants nothing more than to have The Simpsons continue on. Radio Bart. Bart receives a radio set for his birthday and, despite not liking the present at first, eventually comes around to it when he realizes its potential for pulling pranks. One such prank is to drop the radio into a well, and then to remotely convince people nearby that there's a little boy named Timmy O'Toole trapped inside. This mobilizes the whole city into formulating a rescue effort for him, including several celebrities who write a song for him, and the entire well situation is turned into a public spectacle. That is, until Bart realizes that he left a label with his name on the radio, and that soon the whole town might find out it was a prank and that he was the culprit. So he makes an attempt to retrieve the radio, only to fall into the well himself, and when the police find out it was just a prank, decide to call off the whole rescue operation. It isn't until Homer tries to dig Bart out himself that the rest of the city realizes their moral error and starts digging again, this time managing to get to the bottom and retrieve Bart. This episode is based on the real-world story of baby Jessica McClure, a girl who fell down a well in 1987 and had a large media parade around her rescue, as well as the story of Floyd Collins, who had a literal fairground constructed around his rescue attempt, similar to what we saw in this episode. As is typical of The Simpsons, we get to see the worst aspects of a rescue effort like this played out and parodied, the people attaching themselves to the rescue for the sake of personal glory and publicity, as well as those who might only use the event as a means of promoting their own solution, at the expense of a more practical effort. And of course, the entire thing blows over just as quickly as it begins, when the attention of the nation wanes and moves on to some other story. In the end, the town of Springfield is criticized for only doing the right thing when the right thing is also the popular thing to do. In this episode, Bart receives some sort of karmic justice for his history of pranks and harm done to his community. But rather than a moral being taught about the righteousness of the whole situation, we instead watch as the town turns their backs on him, willing to make two wrongs occur rather than to take the high road. When Homer starts digging, this shames the rest of the city into action, as they've seen at least one person do the right thing, even if it's not the easy thing to do in response to being victimized by a prank. So in the end, the people of Springfield want to do the right thing at first because they want to look good, and ultimately end up doing the right thing to avoid looking bad. Lisa the Greek. Lisa is upset that Homer never takes an interest in what she's doing, so Marge suggests reaching out to him instead. She decides to watch football with Homer, only for the duo to learn that Lisa has an uncanny ability in picking the right teams. So Homer begins betting on games and spending more and more time with his daughter, dubbing Sundays as Daddy-Daughter Day. But when Homer stops making plans with Lisa the week after the Super Bowl, Lisa realizes that she was only being used by him to win money, and not because he cared about her. She makes one final prediction on the game, but admits that her judgment may be too clouded by anger to accurately predict, and that she may subconsciously be trying to make Homer fail. In the end, the team she originally bet on comes out on top, revealing that she truly loved her father all along. Lisa ends up with a genuine love of football by the midpoint of this episode, spurred on by a love of her father, and the time that they're spending together. During this moment, she also begins to justify the act of gambling as it's also a vehicle for their togetherness. But her perception of all that changes as her perception of her father does. At first, gambling is a victimless crime, her participation justified as it's doing more good than harm in letting her spend time with her father. But as her love of Homer fades, she starts to acknowledge the wickedness in gambling, fearing for her future should she continue down that path and continue spending time with her father. The trivia people also like to point out about this episode is that the prediction Lisa made regarding the Super Bowl came true, with Washington coming out on top. The following year, the episode was redubbed with the Dallas Cowboys. Once again, Lisa's prediction was accurate. It would have been an interesting bit of tradition had The Simpsons continuously aired this episode prior to the Super Bowl every year, with the names of the teams being tweaked to predict the outcome annually. But perhaps Fox didn't want to draw any more attention to a rival network, or the copyright behind the NFL proved to be too much of a hassle to deal with. Homer alone. Marge has a nervous breakdown and blocks traffic on the Springfield Bridge, leading to her decision to take a vacation on her own so she can unwind away from the family. Bart and Lisa are dropped off at Patty and Selma's, where they're horrified at the lifestyle of their aunts. Homer is left alone with Maggie, but after a few hours of failing to take care of her, the baby runs away, seeking her mother. Homer searches fruitlessly for her, but Maggie is eventually brought back by the police. In the end, Marge manages to learn to relax on her own terms while she's away, and eventually the family is reunited, with the Simpsons hoping that Marge never leaves again. This episode feels like a spiritual successor to The Call of the Simpsons, in that it's less about following a plot and more about putting multiple characters into an unfamiliar situation and seeing how they react to it. It's very sitcom-y in this way, as none of the plots really build up to some conclusion other than the Simpson family needs Marge, which is something that was plainly clear from the beginning anyway. This episode differentiates itself by being much later in the series, where the Simpson family has received 2 seasons of development, and therefore can have reactions to the plot that are more character-driven than the simple satirization marks they were before. And so Homer, who is normally very food-motivated, can turn down an omelet to search for Maggie in order to show off how concerned he is, or how Bart and Lisa typically feud over everything, but show mutual fear and rely on each other to get through the time they spend with the Bouviers. And of course, Marge finally being able to stand up for herself and demand excessive room service at Rancho Relaxo means much more after seeing her behave more passively throughout the rest of the show. Bart the Lover. Bart smashes the fish tank in his classroom during a yo-yo craze and gets a month worth of detention for this. While there, he discovers that Edna Krabappel, his teacher, has put out a personal ad seeking a relationship, and so he makes a fake persona and responds. She falls in love with the fake person Bart created, and the two correspond for a while before Bart finishes off the prank by standing her up on a date. But when he sees her crying alone in a restaurant, he realizes that he's done something wrong and turns to his family for help, letting her down easily. They manage to write a letter that says very little, but just enough that Edna isn't heartbroken, and all ends well. In the B-plot, Ned Flanders tries to track down the source of Todd's recent potty mouth, and finds that Homer's attempts at building a doghouse have corrupted his son. So Homer sets up a swear jar at Marge's advice, and soon, Homer's swearing is enough to simply purchase a doghouse outright. The non-sequitur humor of The Simpsons is on display at its best in this episode, the entire Zinc movie being totally unrelated to the plot and existing purely to establish a later scene. Often, The Simpsons will use an opening completely unrelated to the rest of the episode in order to set up the rest of the plot, with the intro rarely contributing to anything except occasionally a character conflict. Bart is upset that his yo-yo was confiscated, the yo-yo itself being the thing to kick off both Bart's detention and discovery of Edna's personal ad, but then never comes back again. This style helps to lend credence to the believability of the plot and character journeys. Real life doesn't follow story beats, it's just a bunch of stuff that happens. Because the meat of the story is something that doesn't get introduced until partways through, it becomes more believable that the random emotional moments are a natural progression of events. The swear jar in this episode was a plotline introduced as a response to criticism of the show's strong language, that children who watched the show were swearing because they saw television characters doing it. and so we have the plotline that responds directly to this play out as a dispute between the Simpsons and the Flanders, the family you're meant to relate to versus the family you're meant to aspire to. One of the highlights of this episode, ironically, comes from Homer in his post-swearing mindset. Fiddle-dee-dee, that will require a tetanus shot, stands as proof that the showrunners didn't need strong language to produce a gag, and that Homer's potty mouth was a much more conscious decision. Homer at the bat. The Springfield nuclear power plant employees sign up for the softball league at the insistence of Homer, who reveals a secret weapon of his that turns out to be a bat he carved himself, able to easily hit home runs. The boys from the plant are able to go on a massive winning streak that takes them all the way to the finals against the Shelbyville plant. But when Mr. Burns makes a bet with the owner of the other plant, he also decides to give temporary jobs to 9 Major League players who will serve as ringers to beat out the rival team. The men who carried the team to victory are annoyed at their sudden replacement, but in the end, all but one of the replacements are somehow incapacitated, with everybody but Homer getting back their original roles. But during the final pitch of the game, Homer is brought to bat instead of Darryl Strawberry due to Mr. Burns' managerial incompetence, and Homer ends up being struck by the pitch, which gives the team the walk they needed to win. This episode is completely pointless. Nearly everything about it serves no purpose but to crack a few jokes, and it's everything that makes The Simpsons so great as a result. The ultimate goal of the softball game is so Mr. Burns can win $1 million that he can then toss onto the pile. The celebrities are brought in, only to be one by one picked off by the town of Springfield so the original team can play as they would have anyway. And even the multiple celebrity guest stars are added to the show's cast with no real reason for them to be there. You don't have to know anything about baseball or softball to get any of the jokes, and the actual fates each player undergoes has nothing at all to do with who they are as people. The writers could have easily come up with a series of fictional athletes or parodies of actual players and told the exact same jokes. But somehow that wouldn't have been as funny. It's the fact that these total non-sequitur jokes are told about real people that makes the humor work as well as it does. It's as if to say that no target is too high up for The Simpsons, that they have to be treated with the dignity of making their appearance in the show matter. Nothing we do is ever so important as to lose sight of who we are deep down, and the fact that this episode takes such a sardonic look at the way we elevate celebrities helps to drive that fact home. Separate vocations. Springfield Elementary School has its students take a career aptitude test. Bart is given the future career of police officer, while Lisa is given the career of homemaker. Distraught that the school believes she'll never amount to any more than a housewife, Lisa begins skipping band practice and hanging out with delinquents, and after a few days of misbehavior, gets the idea in her head to steal all of the teacher's editions of the textbooks, leaving the staff completely unprepared to teach. Meanwhile, Bart is taken on a ride along with 2 officers where he becomes enthralled with the life of catching criminals and, after getting caught by Skinner assisting the police, is given the role of hall monitor so he can catch the school's various miscreants. But these 2 plots come to a head when Bart catches Lisa with the stolen books and has to decide whether or not to turn her in. In the end, he takes the blame for the crime as he believes that Lisa has too much potential to throw it away, and she is re-motivated to start living her life as she was. An inversion of the typical Bart and Lisa stories, this one shows the 2 characters switching roles within the schools, as they adopt a lifestyle they believe might fit them. But all they switch are the roles, not necessarily lives. Bart doesn't adopt the intelligence of Lisa, instead maintaining his craftiness and ability to outsmart authority to his advantage, thinking up ways that misbehaving students might think, and using his own experience to get an edge over the rest of his classmates. Meanwhile, Lisa maintains her intellect despite her rebellious streak, giving her a sardonic sort of smart mouth that makes an even more effective prankster than Bart ever could have been, driving the school into chaos with just a single evening's detention. In the end, these titular separate vocations just go to show that the direction of the Simpson family's life is headed in is a collection of active choices they've made out of the desire to fit in to what sort of support they're receiving from those around them. Lisa only acts out because she thinks she doesn't have a future, but having Bart remind her that he still thinks highly of her chances is all it takes to have her snap out of her rebellious streak. Likewise, Bart only acts out because that's the best way for him to get attention, but upon realizing that he can get the same reaction from people by lauding authority over them, he changes his life without changing who he is. Dog of Death. The town of Springfield is obsessed with lottery fever, daydreaming of what they'll do should they win. Naturally, nobody relevant wins, but the family gathering around to see the results being pulled also allows them to witness Santa's little helper collapse from a twisted stomach. The surgery to untwist it will cost a large sum of money, but the family all tightens their belt in order to afford to save their dog. The surgery is a success, but the weeks afterwards are tough, and everybody wonders if it was worthwhile to cut back on their standard of living to save Santa's little helper. And eventually the resentment turns to neglect as the dog escapes and wanders into the night. He's found by a dog pound who then sells him to Mr. Burns, who then trains him as an attack dog. But when Bart shows up at Burns' mansion to ask if he's seen the dog, Burns releases the hounds, and after remembering Bart, the family is reunited with their beloved pet. Santa's little helper isn't just an often forgotten part of The Simpsons, but is often a forgotten part of The Simpsons. That's The Simpsons with a capital T the second time. It's difficult to say if he's underutilized in the show, or if there really isn't much of a place for a dog in the realm of satire. Because while each Simpson can serve as a stand-in for some aspect of Western society, it's difficult for an animal to represent much other than itself. And so if most people don't view their pets as any more important than, say, pork chop night, The Simpsons surely won't either. But that's not to say that Santa's little helper exists as a character in a vacuum. As with most of the rest of the cast, he can serve as a spring for comparison to other characters as they're compared to each other in their relationships. Strangely enough, this episode also features another underutilized character in the exact same fashion, Grandpa Simpson. He appears in the first act to misdiagnose Santa's little helper's death and then disappears for the remainder of the episode. It's not as though the showrunners were likely trying to say anything by this inclusion though, it's more likely that this is simply me reaching too far to find something to talk about in a Santa's Little Helper episode. Colonel Homer. After Marge snaps at Homer for being obnoxious during a movie, he rides his car into the night to find some place away from her, and winds up in a hillbilly bar where he hears the country singing of a barmaid named Lurleen Lumpkin. Enamored with her songs, he decides to have her single recorded, and soon, her music hits the airwaves where it's beloved by enough people to get her a syndicated television deal. But as Homer spends more and more time, and the Simpson family's money, on Lurleen's career, Marge begins to worry about Homer's fidelity. These worries turn out to be valid when Lurleen comes on to her new manager, but in the end, Homer resists the advances and goes back to his wife and kids. The sister episode to Life on the Fast Lane, Colonel Homer, is an episode where, after an argument about their marriage, Homer finds solace in another person who seems to understand him on a level better than his own wife. He spends the rest of the episode relying more and more on this other person, while Marge stays at home worrying about the future of the couple, before ultimately there's one last temptation that Homer resists, and they go back to the good thing they had going. Basically the same plot, but with the characters flipped. The differences then are what make this episode stand out. For example, while Marge was willing to go along with the infidelity suggested by jocks from an early point, Homer never consciously agreed to a more involved relationship with Lurleen. He was simply too oblivious to make a more obvious sign against it. And so while Marge's emotional journey back to Homer covered more ground, Homer's had the more consistent high road. Or did it? Because it's one thing to actively try to hurt a person you're in a relationship with, only to change your mind before doing permanent damage. It's another thing to be so unresponsive to your loved one's concerns that you risk that level of damage in the first place through sheer negligence. In the end, both stories have an all's well that ends well wrap-up, and the couple is too relieved to be back with one another to ask questions of the sanctity of their marriage in the first place. Black Widower. Selma introduces her new boyfriend to the Simpson family, Sideshow Bob. He recounts how the two met as part of a prison pen pal program and fell in love, with the two of them beginning to date as soon as he was released from jail. But rather than trying to immediately get his revenge on Bart, Sideshow Bob convinces the Simpsons that he is a changed man, no longer obsessed with vengeance, and instead trying to truly live his life normally. But Bart doesn't stop distrusting him, despite all the setbacks and makeups that his relationship has with Selma, including him openly bad-mouthing MacGyver. But Bart begins to fear for Selma's safety when a few things about the video diaries she's sending back don't add up, and eventually he's correct in assuming that Sideshow Bob hasn't changed, as the entire honeymoon was really just an excuse to murder her to collect inheritance. Another episode that serves as a thematic follow-up to a Season 1 episode. This time it's Krusty Gets Busted that we see built upon. In the original episode, Bart was able to keep his faith in his idols and solve the mystery because he remained a loyal fan, and this time it was his unshakable mistrust of Bob that allowed him to remain vigilant enough to solve the mystery. This episode also builds on the relationship between Bart and Bob in that it establishes more open hostility between the two of them. It could have been possible for this episode to serve as a typical failed love story between Selma and another man, with Bart at first apprehensive over Bob's motivation, but by showing by the third act that the former sideshow clown can't be trusted, it means that his next appearance also comes with a threatening aura to it, as Bob must be up to no good. We also get to see how The Simpsons recognizes its canon. Often canon comes back in the form of quick callbacks, simple glimpses at a background element to remind the audience of an earlier episode or plot point without drawing too much attention away from what's happening in the moment. But this episode requires the prerequisite knowledge of Bart and Bob's relationship in order to have their rivalry make sense. And so we see a flashback to the events of the previous episode that also serves to establish the character dynamic between the two. It's not only the build-off from the first Sideshow Bob episode either, but also a follow-up to Selma's relationship woes as seen in Principal Charming. The Otto Show. Bart and Milhouse attend a Spinal Tap concert where Bart gets the idea into his head to be a rock star. He gets a guitar from his parents and takes it onto the bus, where Otto rocks out for long enough that the students wind up late. So he speeds to make up for the lost time and ends up crashing. Afterwards, it's revealed that he has no license, and he's fired from his job as bus driver with Principal Skinner filling in for him. He tries to retake the test but fails, and so he's forced to live with the Simpson family for a while until he can pass again. Not that he makes any serious efforts to do so. It isn't until his antics annoy the rest of the family that he's eventually kicked out, and so he has to take the test again. This time, however, he actually wants to pass so he can rub it into Homer's face when he succeeds, and when he says as much out loud, Patty Bouvier lets him pass as she hates Homer as much as Otto does. Otto has always served as an example of what Bart Simpson might become, should he continue down the path of slackerdom instead of straightening out. And while there's always been some idea of what the bus driving bum might entail, this episode shows us a closer look at Bart's future, much to the horror of Marge and Homer. But one character who doesn't seem to mind this glimpse is Bart himself. Throughout the episode, he's the only Simpson not to find some annoyance in the antics of the unemployed metalhead. Bart stays supportive of Otto until the very end, and it's that support that ends up getting Otto the motivation to get his job back, that and a healthy amount of shared resentment for Homer. So there's a question of how much of a failure Bart can really wind up as, so long as there are people out there willing to give him second chances as he needs them, and supporting him in whatever goals he sets his mind to. Future episodes of The Simpsons will take a look into these potential futures, everything ranging from nepotism to heartwarming stories of overcoming adversity. And while it's possible that Bart may simply flounder in failure without a more stern figure in his life to straighten him out, the fact that he ultimately does have the support of a loving family is the fundamental difference between him and a character like Otto. Bart's friend falls in love. After a Magic 8-Ball predicts that Bart and Milhouse will stop being friends, a new transfer student named Samantha joins their class, and Milhouse quickly falls in love, no longer spending time with Bart. He tries to maintain the friendship but fails for a time, until learning that Samantha's father forbids her from talking with boys. So Bart tattles on their time together, and soon, Milhouse is separated from his loved one. Racked with guilt, Bart eventually confesses to the breakup, and the two boys fight it out before ultimately deciding not to let the bad blood between them stay. Meanwhile, Lisa grows concerned over Homer's obesity and convinces him to listen to a set of subliminal weight loss tapes, although the company sends him a vocabulary tape instead. Homer's newfound loquacity creates a tumultuous standard within the Simpsons abode before he concludes that the device has no effect on his rotundness or willpower, and he smashes the tape and goes back to not being able to do words good. This episode and Bart the Lover both show the introduction to subplots involving Bart's attempts at understanding romance, or rather, a lack of that understanding. While Lisa routinely gets to have schoolyard crushes or take notice of boys, Bart was very adverse to the other gender for much of the show's early run. He only really starts to have subplots involving romance in the later seasons. For now, he's like every other 10-year-old boy of the time, stereotyped by an aversion to cooties and all things feminine. As such, he routinely shows a failure to comprehend the severity of the relationships that others have. Bart will pull a prank by catfishing Miss Krabappel and not realize until later how much that sort of antic might hurt her. Or he'll tear apart Milhouse's relationship to get his friend back, not realizing how much that love meant to him. But how much does this environment affect his view on relationships? Bart turns to Lisa for advice during this episode, despite her being the younger sibling, so there's a clear recognition of the idea that she's matured faster than him. Is this some inherent aspect of gender, or is the more likely culprit the fact that Bart has received much less pushback from the parents and authority figures in his life, and that he's never really had to mature in the way that Lisa did? The Simpsons as a show never really elaborates on this topic until much later in its run, and even then, often takes an immature and childlike approach to how Bart interacts with girls his age, reflective of his actual age. Perhaps if Bart were aged up to be 13 instead, we could have gotten a much different view of the Simpson family's dynamics surrounding romance. But for now, it's a topic that doesn't even get breached. Brother, can you spare 2 dimes? When it's discovered during the plant physical that Homer is completely sterile, Mr. Burns creates a phony award with a cash prize of $2,000 in order to trick Homer into signing away his right to sue. This catches the attention of Herb Powell from the Season 2 episode, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, who is now homeless after Homer ruined his company and their relationship during the previous season. Herb arrives at the Simpson family's house in order to ask them for that money, and despite each member of the family wanting to spend it on something different, they agree to give it to him so he can create a prototype version of a baby translator. The translator is a success, and Herb is a rich man again, able to buy the Simpson family the things they wanted, as well as rekindling his relationship with Homer. While earlier episodes have shown off the divide between the upper and middle class of America, this is the first to take a much closer look at the very bottom of American society through the lens of characters that we know. But instead of looking at systemic failures that lead to a number of people falling through the social safety net, it instead posits that each person suffering is just a grand idea away from pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. An interesting point to take, after so commonly showing off how Mr. Burns and the rest of the hyper-rich in the country are out of touch if not downright evil characters who live off the misery of others. But perhaps this is meant to take a closer comparison between the wealth of Homer and that of his polar opposite in Herb, the slacker who has received everything versus the hard-working man who came from nothing twice. And this relationship ends up forming a rift between the two in the future. Not an interesting rift that can create future drama, but rather a rift wherein this is the final appearance of Herb Powell in the entire series. He's mentioned later in the form of meta-jokes about how he's never coming back, which draws attention to his lacking return. And the major reason he doesn't make a comeback of this sort ultimately comes down to the fact that the rags to riches and riches to rags plots have already been exhausted. There's nothing interesting to examine about the two brothers with a good relationship and a lot of money between them, without just retreading old ground, and so this is the last we see of Homer's long-lost half-brother. Well, that was pretty long, but with 3 seasons and some shorts down, I've only got about 30 seasons left to go. The Simpsons is a show that's been on the air longer than I've been alive, and at the rate it's continuing on, will probably keep going long after I'm dead. After all, they'll never stop The Simpsons. But don't worry about me, I definitely intend on slowing down as I get further into the series. While the first several seasons had much more in the way of defining and redefining themselves, the later seasons found a groove and rode that much more upright than before. There was still quite a bit to explain surrounding episodes though, as the series looks just as much into the cultural impact of the show as it does into the show itself, and so the next few videos in this series will continue to do so as well. I'll keep continuing on in this direction for as long as The Simpsons remain in the public spotlight, only tapering off as interest wanes, not that that'll start to happen for another few seasons though. Anyway, I don't typically do the YouTuber outro thing, but in this case I'll make an exception because this is the first part of what I hope will be a multi-part series. So if you have an interest in watching me talk about seasons 4 and beyond, go ahead and subscribe. I aim to upload on the first of every month, which is just a bit longer than the YouTube algorithm's attention span, so even if you watch through all of my content in a single sitting, you probably won't be recommended the next part unless you're already subscribed. I may not have been totally comprehensive in this brief retrospective of the series, and if there's something glaring that I excluded that you feel should have been mentioned, go ahead and comment such, though if it's especially bad, there's a good chance you've done so already. Don't worry, I do read every comment on my videos, even if I don't reply to all of them, so if you're setting out to hurt my feelings, you'll accomplish that anyway. Or I guess you could say something nice, but again, that's just as relevant to the algorithm as the other sort of comment. Anyway, most people have tuned out by this point in the video, so it doesn't really matter how I end it. Plus, this part is going to be cut out of the inevitable 34-part complete series, or however many seasons of The Simpsons eventually air, so